On the freezing night of the 17th of November 2020, inside the Clallam County Emergency Dispatch Communications Center in Port Angeles, Washington, a seasoned emergency dispatcher named David Kowalski was nearing the end of a grueling 12-hour night shift. The weather outside was brutal. A severe Pacific Northwest winter storm had battered the Olympic Peninsula for 2 straight days, knocking out power lines across several rural zones, causing minor mudslides, and washing out secondary access roads. Most of the calls coming across David's terminal that evening had been routine for bad weather. Reports of downed fir trees, vehicles sliding into ditches along Highway 101, and elderly residents inquiring about localized electrical outages. At exactly 2:43 in the morning, a priority call bypassed the regular queue and illuminated line 4 on David's console. David adjusted his headset, pressed the answer button, and delivered the standard greeting. Clallam County 911, where is your emergency? For the first 4 seconds, there was no human voice on the line. All David could hear was a faint, distorted hiss of static overlaid with a rhythmic, wet clicking sound, similar to someone lightly tapping a damp microphone against a hard plastic surface. In the background, there was a low, mechanical hum, followed by a heavy draft of wind whistling past a receiver. David repeated himself, speaking clearly into his headset. Clallam County, 911. This line is open. Can you state your location and the nature of your emergency? Then, a voice finally broke through the static. It was the voice of an adult male, but the tone of delivery was so completely flat, monotone, and devoid of natural inflection that David initially wondered if he was listening to a pre-recorded computer text-to-speech system. The caller spoke slowly, pausing unnaturally between words. I am looking at the front yard of 1248 Whispering Pines Road. There is a man standing beside the mailbox. He has been standing in the freezing rain for 4 hours without moving. David typed the address into his terminal. Whispering Pines Road was a remote, heavily wooded private dirt lane situated 12 miles west of Forks, deep inside the coastal temperate rainforest. The homes out there were separated by hundreds of yards of dense spruce and fern growth, completely dark, with 0 streetlights and notoriously poor cellular reception. David looked at his dispatch map and responded, Sir, are you calling from inside 1248 Whispering Pines Road? What is your name? There was a long pause on the other end, lasting nearly 8 seconds. The rhythmic clicking sound continued in the background, steady and precise. The caller finally answered, My name is Wyatt Bennett. I am inside the house. I am looking out the second-floor living room window. The man at the mailbox is wearing a dark, oilskin rain jacket with the hood pulled tight. He has his arms at his sides. He has not changed his stance since midnight. He is looking directly up at this window. David made a note in the dispatch system and initiated a priority dispatch for the nearest Clallam County Sheriff Unit. Due to the severe storm and flooded roads, the closest patrol vehicle was currently 35 miles away, handling a commercial alarm near Beaver, leaving an estimated response time of at least 40 minutes. David spoke in a calm, professional tone. Wyatt, I have deputies en route to your location right now. For your safety, I need you to make sure all exterior doors and ground-level windows are firmly locked. Do not approach the individual. Do you have any exterior floodlights you can turn on? The caller replied immediately, his voice still unsettlingly robotic. The outside lights are already on. The beam illuminates his face. He is not blinking. His mouth is open slightly. His clothing is soaked through, but he is completely rigid. David felt a cold prickle of unease run down the back of his neck. Over his 15 years of handling emergency dispatch, he had processed hundreds of calls involving suspicious persons, prowlers, trespassers, and individuals experiencing severe psychological crises. But people in genuine danger almost always exhibited elevated heart rates, panicked breathing, trembling voices, or frantic speech patterns. Wyatt Bennett's voice had 0 emotional resonance. His pitch remained utterly flat, as if he were reading a list of grocery items. David tried to establish more situational awareness. Wyatt, Is there anyone else in the home with you tonight? Family members, roommates, or visitors? Wyatt answered, I live alone, but the man outside has moved. David sat up straight in his office chair. What is his current position, Wyatt? He walked past the gate. He is walking up the gravel driveway. His movement is not normal. He is dragging his left leg, but his upper body is completely stiff. He is holding an object in his right hand. David typed rapidly into the log. Can you identify the object, Wyatt? Is it a weapon, a flashlight, or a tool? It is a handheld digital camcorder, Wyatt replied, his voice maintaining that same eerie, deadpan pacing. The red recording light is flashing on the front of the lens. He is holding it up to his right eye, filming the front porch as he approaches the front door. David's pulse quickened. Wyatt, I need you to stay away from the windows immediately. Move into an interior room with a solid door, like a bathroom or a walk-in closet, lock it, and wait for law enforcement. Do you have a weapon to protect yourself if necessary? I do not need a weapon, Wyatt said softly. He has reached the porch. Through the headset, David heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of 3 heavy, wooden thuds echoing over the line. Someone was pounding on the heavy front door of the remote house. David leaned into his microphone. Wyatt, do not answer that door. Are you in a secure room? Wyatt did not answer the question. Instead, he spoke in a low whisper that sounded uncomfortably close to the receiver. He is not knocking with his fist. He is hitting the door with his forehead. David felt a deep wave of nausea wash over him. The description was grotesque, unnatural, and completely outside the realm of standard intruder behavior. David pressed his headset closer. Wyatt, answer me. Go to the interior room right now. Deputies are roughly 25 minutes out. Suddenly, the audio quality on the call shifted dramatically. The background hum stopped entirely, and the static cleared up, leaving an audio feed that was crystalline and sharp. Over the line, David heard the sound of glass shattering into dozens of sharp fragments, followed by the heavy thud of a boot stepping through a broken window pane and crunching across glass shards on a hardwood floor. Wyatt's voice returned, but this time there was a bizarre, almost rhythmic cadence to his words. He has entered the lower foyer. He is standing at the base of the staircase. He is turning the camera upward. Wyatt, David yelled, abandoning standard protocol to raise his voice through the line. Get out of there! If there is a back exit or a bedroom window, you need to leave the house immediately. He is climbing the stairs, Wyatt said. He took 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He is pausing on the landing. Over the open line, David could clearly hear the heavy, slow creak of wet boots ascending an old wooden staircase. The sounds were unhurried, heavy, and methodical. Step by step, the intruder climbed toward the upper floor, the sound of labored, wet breathing growing distinctly louder in the background. David watched the GPS tracking icon of the responding deputy cruiser on his screen. The unit was still 16 miles out, navigating a washed-out logging road in torrential rain. Help was not going to arrive in time. Wyatt, hide! David urged, his own voice, now carrying genuine tension. Do not confront him. Hide under a bed. Get in a closet. Do anything to break line of sight. He is at the end of the hallway, Wyatt said. The tone of his voice remained completely devoid of terror, sounding almost detached, like an outside observer narrating a scene from a great distance. He is standing directly outside the doorway. He is pointing the camera at me. David listened intently, his breath caught in his throat. Over the line, a sudden, piercing electronic high-pitched squeal erupted, the familiar acoustic feedback loop that happens when 2 active audio microphones or communication devices are brought within inches of each other in the same physical room. Through the feedback, David heard the sound of heavy, dripping water hitting the floorboards, followed by the slow, raspy inhalation of breath right beside the phone receiver. Then, a voice spoke directly into the phone. It was the exact same voice that had called 911 from the very beginning. The exact same monotone, the exact same pacing, the exact same lack of human inflection. The voice whispered, "I am no longer looking out the window. I am looking into the mirror." Before David could respond, the line went completely dead, replaced by the flat, mechanical tone of an abruptly severed cellular connection. David immediately initiated an emergency reverse ping on the cellular tower that had routed the call. Because Whispering Pines Road was in an area with notoriously fragmented coverage, the initial dispatch had defaulted to the street address provided by the caller's verbal statement. When the computer completed the triangulation against the nearest 3 telecommunication towers near the coastline, the actual geographic coordinate data populated on David's monitor, the call had not originated from 1248 Whispering Pines Road. The physical cell phone transmitting the emergency call was located inside an abandoned, rusted industrial fishing cannery situated at the end of a deserted gravel jetty in Nia Bay, nearly 40 miles north of the dispatched address, an area that had been completely condemned and devoid of human inhabitants since 2014. At that exact moment, the responding Clallam County Sheriff Deputy radioed through to the dispatch center, his voice crackling over the radio frequency. "Dispatch, Unit 412. I have arrived at 1248 Whispering Pines Road. The property is completely dark, checking the exterior now." David gripped his desk microphone, his knuckles turning white. "Unit 412. Proceed with extreme caution." The caller reported the subject made entry through a shattered lower window. Triangulation on the 911 call has returned a major discrepancy. There was a tense silence on the radio channel for nearly 3 minutes as the deputy cleared the perimeter in the blinding storm. Then the deputy's voice came back over the air, sharp, hurried, and noticeably shaken. "Dispatch, be advised. I am at 1248 Whispering Pines. All windows and doors are completely intact, locked, and undisturbed. There are no footprints in the mud, no broken glass, and no signs of any disturbance around the perimeter. But dispatch, you need to run a background check on the property owner immediately." David typed the land registry details into the county database. Unit 412, county records show the residence belongs to a 56-year-old man named Wyatt Bennett. The deputy responded through heavy static. "That is impossible, dispatch. Wyatt Bennett did not make this call tonight. Wyatt Bennett was reported missing from this exact residence 3 years ago in October of 2017, and his case was never solved." Inside the quiet dispatch room, David sat frozen in his chair, staring at the glowing monitor. The 911 audio file had already automatically archived itself onto the county's digital server. David clicked on the playback waveform to review the final 5 seconds of the call, isolating the audio channels to clean up the electronic interference right before the line disconnected. As he enhanced the background layer beneath the caller's final words, David realized that the subtle, rhythmic clicking sound he had heard during the entire 12-minute conversation was not rain, and it was not static. It was the unmistakable acoustic sound of an old cassette tape deck, rewinding and replaying recorded human speech over and over again, directly into the microphone. The realization hit David Kowalski like a physical blow. The call had never been a live conversation. The flat, monotone pauses, the unnatural pacing, and the sudden shifts in audio quality were all the deliberate artifacts of pre-recorded audio fragments being triggered by someone operating a playback device on the other end of the line. David immediately contacted the shift supervisor and coordinated with the Nia Bay Tribal Police and the Washington State Patrol. 2 units stationed near the northern tip of the Olympic Peninsula were dispatched to the abandoned cannery off the coastal jetty, navigating the flooded roads through the teeth of the gale-force storm. It took the coastal units nearly 40 minutes to reach the desolate perimeter. The rusted, corrugated steel structure of the old cannery stood isolated against the black surf of the Pacific Ocean, battered by churning waves and howling winds. The officers breached the padlocked main loading doors with a Halligan bar and moved inside with high-powered tactical searchlights, clearing through rows of rotting conveyor belts, collapsed wooden catwalks, and pools of stagnant, brackish water. In the center of what had once been the primary refrigeration vault, 30 feet underground and insulated by thick cork-lined walls, they found the source of the cellular transmission. Resting on a rusted metal workbench was a vintage 4-track reel-to-reel magnetic tape deck, hardwired into an external automotive battery and connected via an auxiliary audio patch cable directly into the charging port of a prepaid cellular burner phone. Beside the tape deck lay dozens of labeled cassette reels, a microphone mixer, and a pair of studio headphones. When investigators from the Washington State Crime Lab processed the physical evidence over the following 72 hours, the forensic audio breakdown uncovered a horrifyingly calculated timeline. The voice on the tapes really was that of Wyatt Bennett. Wyatt had not disappeared into thin air in 2017. He had been abducted from his home on Whispering Pines Road by an individual who had stalked him for months, documenting his habits, his voice, and his daily routines. In the years following his disappearance, the captor had meticulously recorded hundreds of hours of Wyatt speaking under extreme psychological duress, forcing him to read scripted sentences into a microphone in that unnatural, monotone cadence phrases, describing intruders, describing looking out windows, describing entering rooms, and narrating horrifyingly specific acts of violence. The tape that had played over the 911 call on November 17th had been assembled from those very recordings, carefully spliced together to orchestrate a phantom break-in and manipulate emergency services into rushing to the abandoned Whispering Pines residence miles away. Mounted directly above the tape deck in the cannery vault was a battery-powered security monitor displaying 4 live video camera feeds. As the detectives examined the screen, their blood ran cold. The camera feeds were streaming in real time from inside the Clallam County Dispatch Center parking lot in Port Angeles, showing the employee vehicles, the rear exit door, and the perimeter fence. The perpetrator had not intended to lure police to Whispering Pines Road out of random malice. The entire 911 call had been an elaborate diversion designed to draw every active deputy and patrol unit out to the furthest, most isolated corners of the county, leaving the dispatch center and the surrounding township virtually unattended in the middle of a catastrophic storm. And resting right beside the live surveillance monitor on the rusted workbench was a single, newly recorded cassette tape with a handwritten label taped across the plastic shell. It bore a date marker set for the following morning, along with the neatly written name of the dispatcher who had answered the call, David Kowalski. In early September of 2021, a 34-year-old museum conservator named Darren Kelly purchased a property that felt like the realization of a lifelong dream. Darren had spent more than a decade working in Boston, living in small, overpriced brick apartments where space was at an absolute premium. His specialty was the physical restoration of antique furniture and historical woodwork, a craft that required dedicated square footage, excellent natural lighting, and total quiet. After saving diligently for years, Darren began searching throughout the historic towns of New England for an older home with authentic colonial architecture that had not been butchered by modern open-concept renovations. He found a listing for an expansive 2-story saltbox colonial home located on the wooded outskirts of Greenfield, Massachusetts. The house had originally been erected in 1788, sitting quietly at the end of an unpaved lane off Silver Street, surrounded by 3 acres of dense sugar maples and ancient stone walls. It had remained in the possession of a single reclusive family for over 4 generations before finally being transferred to a bank trust following the death of its last elderly occupant in late 2019. Because the property required significant cosmetic work, including plaster restoration, rewiring, and extensive carpentry repairs, the purchase price was exceptionally reasonable. Darren closed on the sale on September 18th, loaded his specialized woodshop tools, clamps, and personal belongings into a 20-foot box truck, and made the drive west into Franklin County. During the first few weeks of autumn, the Greenfield house seemed ideal. The ground floor featured wide plank pumpkin pine floors, heavy hand-hewn ceiling beams, two massive central brick fireplaces, a formal parlor, a dining room, and an expansive rear addition that Darren immediately claimed as his primary furniture conservation workshop. The upper level contained two large corner bedrooms, a single bathroom fitted with vintage plumbing, and an open landing that looked down over the front foyer. The house was cold, smelling intensely of dry lath plaster, old beeswax, and centuries of wood ash trapped deep within the masonry flues. But for Darren, those scents were the natural hallmarks of historical timber framing. Whenever the autumn wind off the Deerfield River rattled, the antique 6/6 window sashes or the floor joists popped during sudden evening temperature drops, he simply noted the structural settling as normal character traits of an 18th century structure. However, as November of 2021 arrived and the temperatures plummeted into the low 20s, Darren began to notice a peculiar spatial discrepancy that nagged at his professional architectural instincts. Because of his background in historic preservation, Darren had an exceptional eye for structural dimensions, load-bearing proportions, and spatial symmetry. While taking detailed laser tape measurements on the ground floor to construct custom wooden shelving for his workshop tools, he measured the total length of the exterior north-facing foundation wall from the outside, which measured exactly 46 feet. Yet, when he went inside the house and measured the interior length of the back parlor and his adjoining workshop along that very same north wall, the combined interior measurement totaled only 34 feet. Even after accounting for the massive central chimney stack, double-thick lath and plaster walls, and exterior timber framing, there was an unaccounted void of approximately 12 linear feet along the rear spine of the ground floor. At first, Darren assumed that the space was merely a dead architectural cavity created during a 19th century addition, perhaps an abandoned pantry shaft or a sealed chimney support pier. But the more he looked at the layout of the back parlor, the less sense the exterior window placement made. From the outside of the house, looking at the rear facade, there were three identical double-hung windows spaced evenly across the lower level. Inside the house, however, there were only two windows visible, one in the parlor and one in his workshop. The middle window, visible clearly from the overgrown backyard garden, did not open into any room on the ground floor. It was completely obscured from the interior by a solid wall of heavy, floor-to-ceiling dark pine wainscoting paneling that ran along the east side of the fireplace. On the evening of the 24th of November 2021, the night before Thanksgiving, a heavy, freezing rainstorm rolled across western Massachusetts, trapping Darren inside the house with the wood stove burning hot. Armed with a pry bar, a heavy rubber mallet, a carpenter level, and a high-intensity work light, Darren decided to investigate the dead space behind the paneling once and for all. He set up the work light in the back parlor, illuminating the dark pine boards that lined the chimney alcove. He ran his fingers along the joints of the vertical planks, searching for the telltale head of modern drywall screws or antique cut nails. As his hand brushed against the lower right section of the center raised panel, roughly 2 inches above the baseboard molding, he felt a subtle, spring-loaded give in the wood. Darren knelt down on the pine floorboards, shining his light directly into the fine vertical seam between the panels. There, concealed within a recessed groove in the wood, was a small, hand-forged iron latch mechanism, completely unpainted and virtually invisible to anyone not actively searching for a seam. Darren placed the tip of his flathead screwdriver into the latch channel and applied firm upward pressure. With a dull, dry snap that echoed through the quiet house, the internal iron catch disengaged. A 6-foot-tall section of the solid pine wainscoting swung outward by 2 inches, revealing a concealed door frame set flush into the framing timbers. The air that poured through the freshly opened seam was shockingly frigid, thick with the heavy, sweet scent of ancient lime dust, dry cedar shavings, and cold, damp wool that had remained sealed away from sunlight for decades, Darren stood up slowly, gripping the heavy rubber mallet in his right hand and switching on a high-powered tactical LED flashlight with his left. He pulled the concealed pine panel completely open on its hidden iron pintle hinges. The beam of his flashlight cut through a dense curtain of undisturbed cobwebs, illuminating a narrow, rectangular secret room that measured roughly 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, positioned directly between the back of the parlor wall and the exterior timber siding of the house. The room possessed a low ceiling made of exposed, rough-sawn joists, completely insulated with dense layers of horsehair and compressed newspaper clippings dating back to the late 1930s. The middle window that Darren had observed from the exterior was indeed located in the center of the outer wall, but the interior side of the glass had been thoroughly blacked out using heavy coats of dark oil-based enamel paint, preventing any light from leaking out into the yard. Darren stepped across the wooden threshold, his boots crunching loudly over a thin layer of dry plaster chips that had flaked away from the framing. The room was not empty. It was entirely, meticulously furnished as a private, self-contained living compartment. Against the far back wall sat a single, narrow iron cot fitted with an old horsehair mattress, neatly made with a faded patchwork quilt and 2 rough wool blankets. Beside the bed rested a low wooden nightstand crafted from unfinished pine boards. Sitting atop the nightstand was an unlit kerosene lamp with an intact glass chimney, a half-empty box of wooden strike-anywhere matches, a pair of wire-rimmed reading spectacles, and an open ceramic shaving mug containing a dried boar-bristle brush. Darren approached the cot slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs in the dead silence of the hidden room. He moved the beam of the flashlight toward the center of the chamber, where a small wooden writing desk sat positioned against the interior wall. Resting on the surface of the desk was an old mechanical portable typewriter with a blank sheet of discolored rag paper rolled halfway around the rubber platen. Beside the typewriter sat a small stack of leather-bound personal journals, bound with thick twine. Darren stepped up to the desk, set the rubber mallet down on the floorboards, and pulled his clean cotton work gloves from his pocket to handle the delicate historical artifacts. He gently lifted the top journal from the stack, carefully untying the faded twine. He opened the front cover. Written across the inside page in sharp black fountain pen ink was a single name, accompanied by a series of precise date ranges extending from the 12th of October, 1974, all the way through the 3rd of March 2018. Darren turned the brittle pages, scanning the entries. The writing was not a collection of personal memoirs or historical family reflections. It was an exhaustive, daily observational log tracking the movements of the house's primary occupants over 44 continuous years. The journal detailed exact waking times, meal preparations, daily arguments, financial discussions, and medical routines of the previous elderly family members who had owned the house, recorded in clinical, emotionless detail. Darren felt a cold wave of nausea rise in the back of his throat. He looked down at the entry dated the 3rd of March 2018, the day the final elderly occupant of the house had suffered a fatal medical emergency in the front parlor. The entry read, "The ambulance has arrived at the front gate. The paramedics are loading the stretcher. The house is now clear. I will remain inside the framing until the estate settles." Darren stood frozen, his eyes scanning the final lines of the page. The bank had taken possession of the house in late 2019, and the house had supposedly sat vacant until Darren moved in 2 months ago in September of 2021. Darren slowly closed the journal and reached for the second notebook beneath it on the stack. This notebook was entirely different. It was a modern, plastic-covered spiral notebook, completely fresh and devoid of age-related discoloration. Darren flipped open the front cover. Across the first page, written in fresh blue ballpoint ink, was the date, the 18th of September, 2021, the exact date Darren had moved into the property. The journal continued with hundreds of daily log entries running up to the present week. September 22nd. The new owner is a woodworker. He sleeps in the northwest bedroom. He drinks coffee at 6:15 in the morning. He works until 11 at night. October 14th. He is measuring the parlor floorboards. He is getting closer to the chimney stack. November 24th. He has brought a hammer and a pry bar into the parlor at 9 in the evening. Darren dropped the notebook onto the desk as if it had burned his skin. He spun around in the narrow space, his flashlight beam trembling violently as he shone the light across the hidden chamber. There, resting directly at the foot of the iron cot, which he had initially mistaken for an old roll of canvas, was a pair of modern, fleece-lined winter slippers, completely clean and lightly damp from fresh perspiration. Beside the slippers sat a small, battery-operated digital audio baby monitor receiver plugged into a hidden extension cord behind the wainscoting, actively picking up the loud, heavy sound of Darren's own breathing echoing back through the speaker. And from directly above the ceiling joists of the secret room, in the pitch-black crawlspace tucked between the ground floor ceiling and the second-floor subfloor, Darren heard the faint, distinct sound of a floorboard shifting under slow, deliberate human weight, followed by the quiet click of a metal latch being drawn back directly above his head. Darren did not pause to look up into the ceiling rafters. Pure survival reflex took command of his limbs. He threw himself backward through the open concealed panel, tumbling onto the wide pine floorboards of the back parlor. As he scrambled to his feet, he heard the sharp splintering of dry lathwood as a rectangular ceiling trapdoor dropped open directly inside the secret room behind him, sending a heavy cloud of gray horsehair insulation swirling into the beam of his work lamp. Darren grabbed the edge of the heavy wainscoting panel, slammed it shut into its frame, and shoved the heavy oak timber workbench across the floorboards, wedging its massive 100-pound frame tight against the hidden seam. From inside the wall came a series of violent, heavy impacts as someone threw their body weight against the pine paneling, rattling the framing timbers of the chimney breast. Darren did not wait for the wood to give way. He bolted across the parlor, tore through the front hallway, snatched his phone and truck keys from the entry table, and burst through the front door into the freezing rain. He jumped into his pickup truck, locked the cab doors, threw the transmission into reverse, and backed down the unpaved lane at breakneck speed until he reached the paved road, immediately dialing 911. Within 15 minutes, 4 cruisers from the Greenfield Police Department and the Massachusetts State Police sped down Silver Street, their blue and red emergency strobes cutting through the sheets of cold rain. 6 armed officers breached the front entrance of the colonial house with service weapons drawn, clearing the parlor, workshop, and upper bedrooms before systematically breaching the sealed void behind the chimney. When officers forced back the heavy wainscoting and secured the secret room, the space was empty, but the ceiling hatch remained hanging wide. Tactical officers climbed into the ceiling void, following a reinforced plywood crawlway that ran between the floor joists of the entire house, directly connecting the secret chamber to the unfinished attic and down into an old exterior bulkhead beneath the rear porch. A perimeter search team with K9 units quickly tracked fresh footprints in the muddy garden soil behind the property, discovering an elderly, emaciated man hiding inside a dry drainage culvert beneath the stone wall at the edge of the woods, shivering in soaked clothing. When detectives processed the fingerprints and medical records of the 71-year-old man, the full, incomprehensible history of the Greenfield Saltbox House came into terrifying focus. The man was identified as Arthur Sterling, the youngest son of the original patriarch who had owned the house in the mid-20th century. Arthur had been officially reported missing and presumed dead by Massachusetts authorities in the winter of 1974. Following what family members had claimed was a catastrophic drowning accident in the Deerfield River during an ice storm. In reality, Arthur had never left the property. Following a severe psychological breakdown in his early 20s, the deeply insular patriarchal family had constructed the concealed chamber behind the central fireplace wainscoting, hiding Arthur away from the public, social services, and the law. For 44 consecutive years, while his siblings and parents grew old, managed the estate, and eventually died off one by one, Arthur had lived as an invisible inhabitant within the hollow cavities of the house. He moved through the crawl spaces in total silence, descending into the kitchen in the dead of night to gather leftover food, observing the passage of decades entirely through small peepholes cut into the lath and plaster behind wall clocks and vintage mirrors. When the last living family member suffered a fatal heart attack in the parlor in 2018, Arthur simply retreated into the structural framing, continuing his subterranean existence while the house sat bank-owned and vacant for nearly 2 years, surviving on stockpiled non-perishable goods and water collected from an old gravity-fed cistern in the basement. When Darren Kelly purchased the property in the fall of 2021, Arthur did not see the new owner as an intruder to attack, but as a new subject to catalog and observe. He had adapted to Darren's woodworking schedule, listening to every phone call through the floorboards, tracking every step Darren took with the laser tape measure, and retreating into the upper ceiling cavity whenever Darren worked too close to the hidden panel. Arthur Sterling was taken into protective medical custody and transferred to a state psychiatric care facility in Worcester, where he was provided with intensive psychological treatment after spending nearly half a century sealed away from the outside world. Darren Kelly spent the following 3 days packing his tools and conservation equipment into a moving trailer under private security supervision. He broke his purchase agreement through legal arbitration on grounds of non-disclosed structural habitation, returned to the Boston area, and permanently shifted his furniture restoration business into modern, open commercial studios, never again setting foot inside a historical home without checking every square inch behind the walls. In late October of 2019, a 34-year-old private security officer named Lucas Finch accepted an overnight security contract at the Mercer Valley Medical Center, an expansive regional hospital complex located in the Berkshire Hills of Western Massachusetts. Lucas was an observant, highly disciplined former municipal auxiliary officer who had spent nearly a decade handling late-night asset protection, surveillance infrastructure monitoring, and facility access control. He preferred working graveyard shifts because of the quiet, solitary atmosphere, which allowed him to perform his duties without the constant interruptions and chaotic foot traffic of daytime hospital operations. The Mercer Valley Medical Center was an enormous, sprawling architectural hybrid. The Central Hospital Pavilion and the Emergency Department were modern, 4-story brick and glass structures built in the late 1990s, fully equipped with high-tech keycard scanners, motion sensors, and bright LED lighting. However, the eastern and western peripheries of the facility incorporated older historic wings dating back to the late 1920s, which had originally functioned as a county tuberculosis sanatorium and later as an isolation ward during the mid-20th century. Among these older sections was Wing C, a massive 3-story stone and masonry annex located on the 4th floor above the decommissioned physical therapy suites. According to county health records and municipal safety filings, Wing C had been entirely decommissioned, condemned, and permanently walled off in November of 1998 due to extensive asbestos contamination, black mold growth, and deteriorating structural concrete floor joists. During the facility modernization 20 years earlier, hospital administration had completely severed the utility lines to Wing C. The interior elevators were programmed to bypass the 4th floor annex entirely, and the primary entrance corridor connecting the main hospital to the old wing had been permanently sealed behind a thick, floor-to-ceiling partition of reinforced drywall and industrial cinder block masonry. On modern digital fire evacuation maps and computerized hospital floor plans, Wing C did not even have an assigned room number. It was simply represented as a large, grayed-out void labeled as unallocated mechanical plenum. Lucas worked the 11 to 7 night shift, accompanied by only one other guard, an older, laid-back officer named Arthur Gibbons, who spent most of the night monitoring the main lobby reception desk and checking in ambulance transfers. Lucas was responsible for conducting the physical walking patrols, systematically clocking into electronic checkpoint stations across the 7 interconnected hospital buildings every 2 hours. For the first 4 weeks of his contract, the assignments were predictable and routine. Lucas would walk through the dimly lit corridors, check locked pharmacy vaults, ensure medical storage doors were secured, and log any maintenance issues with the facility engineers. The older wings of the hospital were always cold and drafty, filled with the low, constant hum of commercial air handling units, the faint ticking of radiant steam pipes, and the sharp, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and industrial bleach. The disturbing occurrences began on the night of the 14th of November 2019, around 2:30 in the morning. Lucas was conducting his mandatory third-floor walking sweep through the Administrative Records Archive, an area situated directly beneath the sealed concrete footprint of Wing C. The hallway was completely dark, save for the green emergency exit signs casting long, pale shadows across the linoleum tile floor. As Lucas stood beneath an old, galvanized ceiling return vent to scan an electronic patrol barcode with his handheld scanner, he heard a faint, distinct sound drifting down through the ductwork from the sealed floor above. It was not the mechanical rattling of an air compressor, and it was not the high-pitched squeak of mice navigating the subflooring. It was the distinct, rhythmic cadence of human whispers. The voices were low, muffled, and indistinct, sounding like two people standing close together in an empty room, carrying on a hurried, urgent conversation. Lucas froze on the spot, lowering his scanner to his side and holding his breath. He tilted his head toward the metal ceiling vent, listening with intense concentration. The whispering continued for roughly 15 seconds, rising and falling in natural conversational inflection before terminating with a soft, hollow sound like a wooden cabinet door being gently pressed shut against a rubber gasket. Lucas walked back down to the security operations hub on the ground floor and brought the incident to Arthur's attention. Arthur merely laughed, waving his hand dismissively. Arthur told Lucas that the central ventilation shafts in the historic wings were notorious for acoustic channeling, explaining that sound from the active pediatric intensive care unit on the 3rd floor often bounced through the sheet metal ductwork and created strange auditory illusions near the old ceilings. Lucas tried to accept Arthur's rational explanation, but over the following week, the sounds became more frequent, more distinct, and increasingly localized. Every night between 2 and 4 in the morning, whenever Lucas reached the top of the central stairwell on the 3rd floor, he could distinctly hear movements echoing directly above his head, originating from the completely dark, sealed void of Wing C. The sounds were unmistakable. The slow, measured scuff of shoe soles dragging across bare concrete, the metallic clatter of small instruments being dropped onto a steel tray, and the low, continuous murmuring of multiple human voices whispering in complete darkness. On the night of the 22nd of November 2019, Lucas decided he could no longer ignore the disturbance. He was convinced that either unauthorized squatters had managed to find an exterior fire escape route into the condemned wing, or employees were using the unmonitored space for illegal drug use and theft of hospital medical supplies. Equipped with his duty belt, a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, a high-voltage stun device, and a master maintenance master keyring he checked out from the facility engineering lockbox, Lucas climbed to the 4th floor of the central medical tower. He walked past the quiet, locked offices of the hospital billing department until he reached the end of the western hallway. There, at the dead end of the corridor, was the massive, seamless drywall partition that had been constructed in 1998 to wall off Wing C. The wall was painted the same off-white eggshell color as the rest of the floor, marked only by a small yellow plastic sign reading, "Authorized Maintenance Access Only, Sealed Hazardous Abatement Zone." In the lower right-hand corner of the wall, nearly hidden behind a large commercial floor buffing machine, was a narrow, heavy steel access door measuring 3 feet wide by 6 feet tall. The door had no exterior handle, secured only by a high-security deadbolt cylinder and a heavy steel padlocked hasp. Lucas inspected the padlock. The brass body was covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust, and the shackle was firmly locked. However, as Lucas knelt down closer to the bottom edge of the steel door with his flashlight, he noticed a startling physical detail. The heavy, black rubber sweep along the bottom of the doorframe was completely free of dust. In fact, directly on the linoleum floor outside the threshold were two clean, fresh white marks, indicating that the bottom of the door had swung inward across the floor multiple times within the last few hours. Lucas pulled out the engineering master ring and found the matching brass cylinder key. He inserted the key into the deadbolt. The lock turned with a smooth, oiled, and completely silent click, showing zero signs of internal corrosion or resistance. Lucas took a deep breath, pulled the steel door open by several inches, and clicked on his tactical flashlight. A freezing, dense draft of air poured out from the opening, carrying the heavy, suffocating scent of stagnant lime dust, aged copper, and a sharp, unmistakable medicinal smell of fresh isopropyl alcohol. Lucas stepped through the doorway, letting the steel access door rest lightly on its latch behind him. The scene, illuminated by his flashlight beam, was like stepping into an abandoned time capsule. The hallway of Wing C stretched out for more than 200 feet into absolute blackness. The walls were lined with crumbling, pale green plaster that was peeling off in long, dry strips, exposing the dark wooden laths beneath. The floor was bare, unpolished concrete, littered with scattered piles of rotted fiberglass insulation and fallen ceiling tiles. Along both sides of the corridor were dozens of open hospital patient rooms, their rusted iron privacy curtain tracks hanging twisted from the ceiling framework. There was no electricity, no running water, and no emergency lighting. The silence inside the wing was so absolute and heavy that Lucas could hear the soft, rhythmic rasp of his own cotton uniform against his chest. Lucas kept his flashlight beam low, scanning the concrete floor as he walked slowly down the central corridor. What he saw on the floor made his heart rate spike instantly. Cutting through the thick, gray layer of 20-year-old asbestos dust on the concrete was a clean, heavily traveled pathway of overlapping boot prints. The prints were sharp and modern, showing the lugged sole patterns of high-end tactical footwear. Lucas followed the footprints down the hallway, bypassing empty rooms filled with broken wooden bed frames, rusted IV poles, and stacks of yellowed paper patient charts from the 1970s. As he reached the far end of the wing, near what had once been the primary surgical suites and quarantine observation rooms, the layout of the corridor changed. The peeling wallpaper and broken plaster on the walls had been neatly scraped away and replaced with thick, sound-dampening acoustic insulation panels secured to the timber studs with heavy industrial staples. At the very end of the corridor was an old, double-hinged wooden door labeled Room 418, Special Observation. The double doors had been fitted with modern, heavy-duty weather stripping along every seam to create an airtight seal, and the small, wire-reinforced rectangular viewing windows had been completely blacked out with multiple layers of dark automotive window tint. Lucas stepped up to the door, pressing his ear flat against the wood. From inside the darkened room, the whispering voices were louder and clearer than they had ever been. There were 3 distinct voices, 2 males and 1 female, speaking in low, clinical tones. Their words punctuated by the soft, rhythmic clicking of electronic switches and the distinct, wet, mechanical breathing sound of a portable, automated medical ventilator. Lucas placed his gloved hand on the brass lever handle, pushed the door open an inch, and peered into the room. Illuminated by the eerie, pulsing blue glow of several battery-operated physiological vital sign monitors, the interior of Room 418 had been converted into a pristine, fully functional, modern intensive care unit. Sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by rows of intravenous infusion pumps and sterile surgical trays, was an active, motorized hospital bed. and lying in the center of that bed, connected to a running mechanical ventilator with an intravenous line running into his arm, was a patient whose hospital identification wristband bore a date of admission stamped with that very morning's date, bearing the name of an individual who had officially been pronounced deceased in the emergency room downstairs 12 hours earlier. Before Lucas could pull his radio from his belt to call for help, a heavy, gloved hand reached out from the pitch-black shadows behind the door, grabbing the collar of his uniform and violently dragging him into the dark room as the heavy wooden door slammed shut and locked from the inside. Lucas did not surrender to the sudden, violently shifting dark. The moment his back hit the cold concrete wall inside room 418, his muscle memory and defensive training took over. He twisted his torso hard to the left, breaking the attacker's grip on his tactical collar, drove his heavy steel-toed boot into the individual's shin, and ripped his high-voltage stun device from his duty belt. In the chaotic, strobing glow of the blue medical monitors, Lucas saw two figures clad in full sterile surgical gowns, masks, and nitrile gloves scrambling toward him. Lucas drove the stun device into the chest of the nearest assailant, firing a 5-second electrical discharge that dropped the man instantly to the floor in violent muscle spasms. The second figure, a woman holding a pre-filled medical syringe, hesitated, retreating backward toward the operating cart. Lucas lunged forward, kicked the syringe from her hand, shoved her against the metal cabinetry, and hit the orange emergency distress toggle on his radio shoulder unit, screaming into the open frequency. "Officer in distress, 4th floor, sealed annex, room 418, armed intrusion in progress." Down in the main lobby, Arthur Gibbons heard the desperate distress call cut through the silence of the reception desk. Arthur immediately hit the hospital facility-wide panic lock, dialed 911 for emergency state police tactical response, and summoned the on-duty facility engineering supervisor with master override keys. Within 7 minutes, 3 cruisers from the Massachusetts State Police Barracks in Lee and 2 armed municipal officers from the local department converged on the facility. Tactical officers, accompanied by the engineering supervisor, breached the sealed 4th-floor partition door, moving rapidly down the dark, abandoned corridor of Wing C, with weapons drawn and tactical weapon lights illuminating the dust. They kicked open the reinforced door of room 418, taking all 3 individuals in surgical gowns into custody at gunpoint without further gunfire. Paramedics rushed into the makeshift clinic, immediately securing the intubated patient on the bed, stabilizing his intravenous lines, and transferring him down to the active intensive care pavilion on the 2nd floor. Over the following 48 hours, the Massachusetts State Police, the Department of Public Health, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation unraveled one of the most disturbing, calculated black market medical operations in regional history. The intubated patient was 54-year-old Gregory Vance, a wealthy industrial real estate developer who had arrived at the emergency department early that morning following a severe induced cardiac collapse. The 3 individuals arrested in the room were Dr. Julian Mercer, a senior consulting anesthesiologist on the hospital staff, accompanied by 2 former surgical technicians whose medical licenses had been revoked years earlier. Dr. Mercer was the grandson of the original sanatorium founder and had maintained access to the unmapped architectural blueprints of Wing C for decades. Over the course of 18 months, Mercer and his associates had secretly transported medical equipment, portable generators, ventilators, and surgical drugs into the condemned wing during late-night maintenance windows, using the abandoned service hoist in the rear freight shaft that bypass standard security checkpoints. The horrifying purpose behind the illicit facility was an elaborate, multi-million-dollar staged death and illegal organ procurement ring. Wealthy clients facing severe criminal indictments or overwhelming corporate debt would pay Mercer enormous sums to stage their medical deaths in the lower emergency department using specialized paralytic agents that mimicked terminal flatline brain activity. Once the patients were officially declared deceased by compromised staff, their bodies were diverted from the hospital morgue transit carts into the freight shaft and brought up to Wing C. There, inside the soundproofed observation suite, the patients were placed on life support, stabilized, and prepped for off-grid synthetic identity handoffs or clandestine tissue extraction procedures before being smuggled out through the rear ground floor loading dock under cover of night. The whispering voices Lucas had heard through the ceiling air vents were Mercer and his technicians conducting routine clinical checks and ventilator adjustments on their hidden subjects. Dr. Julian Mercer and his two conspirators were indicted in federal district court on dozens of felony charges, including attempted murder, medical fraud, conspiracy to harvest human biological material, and unlawful imprisonment. In late 2020, Mercer was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 45 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Raybrook, New York. Gregory Vance survived the ordeal, was placed under federal protective custody, and later testified against the operation in exchange for leniency regarding his own financial fraud investigations. The hospital board immediately launched an independent architectural audit, permanently demolishing the entire interior of Wing C down to the bare foundation beams, replacing it with an open-air rooftop solar array. Lucas Finch received a formal commendation for bravery from the Berkshire County District Attorney, but resigned from overnight private security shortly thereafter, taking a daylight administrative post with the state environmental police content to never set foot inside an old medical facility after midnight ever again. In late December of 2021, a 32-year-old freelance mapmaker and geographical data surveyor named Isaac Sterling lived in total isolation on the eastern slopes of the Green Mountains near the small town of Warren, Vermont. Isaac spent the majority of his professional life processing satellite telemetry, drawing high-precision topographical trail guides, and working in complete digital solitude. When a major geographical foundation awarded him a multi-year grant to map regional mountain drainages, he chose to live where the work was right outside his back door. The house he rented was an A-frame timber cabin perched along an unpaved logging route known as Lincoln Gap Road. The structure sat on a heavily wooded, 4-acre shelf of land surrounded by dense stands of sugar, maple, paper birch, and towering eastern hemlocks. During the warmer summer months, tourists occasionally drove through the mountain pass, but by late autumn, the town municipality shut down the road gates due to extreme ice and drifting snow, cutting off vehicle access entirely until spring. For 5 continuous months every winter, the only way in or out was by snowmobile or snowshoes. The nearest permanent neighbor lived more than 2 miles down the valley. Isaac loved the extreme seclusion. His cabin had a stone hearth that provided steady heat, a high-speed satellite uplink powered by solar batteries and a propane generator, and a wide second-floor loft that served as his bedroom and workspace. His companion was a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix named Jasper, an energetic, highly observant dog who usually alerted Isaac to every passing white-tailed deer or foraging black bear in the tree line. On the morning of the 22nd of December 2021, a massive winter storm swept across northern New England, dumping nearly 14 inches of pristine, powdery snow across the mountains. The wind howled through the timber frame all afternoon, shaking the glass gables and burying the front porch in thick, sculptured drifts. By midnight, the storm system broke completely, leaving behind an eerie, crystal-clear night sky with temperatures plummeting down to 7 degrees below zero. At approximately 7 o'clock the following morning, Isaac woke up to make his usual pot of dark roast coffee. He strapped on his insulated winter boots, pulled on a heavy fleece jacket, and stepped out onto the wide front porch with a snow shovel to clear the path leading down to the firewood shed. The morning air was razor sharp, freezing the moisture in his nostrils with every deep breath. The entire forest was painted in blinding white, bathed in absolute dead silence. There was no wind, no sound of distant traffic, and no bird calls. As Isaac pushed his shovel into the first fresh drift at the base of the porch stairs, his eyes caught a dark, broken pattern across the pristine surface of the snow. Beginning near the dense spruce thicket at the northern edge of his property line, a single line of deep, clean footprints cut straight across the virgin snowdrifts, heading directly toward the cabin. Isaac stopped shoveling, leaning on the wooden handle of his shovel. At first glance, he assumed a wandering hunter, an off-trail snowshoer, or a backcountry skier from the Sugarbush Resort had lost their way during the blizzard. But as Isaac walked closer to inspect the impressions, a strange wave of disorientation washed over him. The footprints had not been made by snowshoes, nor were they made by the heavy, lugged tread of modern winter mountaineering boots. The impressions were completely smooth on the bottom, narrow, and elongated, measuring roughly 12 inches in length. They looked exactly like the imprint of bare human feet, wrapped tightly in thin strips of coarse, untreated canvas or burlap. Even stranger was the gait. The stride length between each footprint was unnervingly long, spaced nearly 5 feet apart, meaning whoever made them was either extraordinarily tall or was taking massive, bounding strides through 14 inches of dense, freezing powder without dragging their feet. Isaac knelt down, placing his gloved hand into the center of the freshest print. The edges of the snow were sharp, crisp, and completely unmarred by wind drift. The tracks had been made within the last 2 hours, long after the blizzard had stopped falling around 5 in the morning. Isaac stood up and looked back toward the woods. A natural survival instinct urged him to go back inside, bolt the heavy oak door, and call the state police dispatcher in Waterbury. But Isaac was a cartographer and tracker by trade. His entire life was built around mapping terrain, reading physical signs on the earth, and understanding pathways. He whistled for Jasper, but the dog refused to step off the wooden porch deck, sitting rigidly by the front door, with his ears pinned flat against his head, staring silently into the trees with a low, nervous tremor in his chest. Isaac walked over to the firewood shed, picked up a heavy, steel-shafted splitting maul for protection, and strapped a pair of lightweight aluminum snowshoes onto his winter boots. He decided to follow the tracks backward to their point of origin, determined to find out who had walked onto his isolated mountain property in sub-zero weather without proper boots. The trail led Isaac across the open clearing, weaving through a dense cluster of young birch saplings, and descended into a steep, heavily shadowed ravine where a frozen mountain brook ran between granite ledges. As Isaac pushed through the knee-deep snow, the track pattern became increasingly bizarre. The footprints never hesitated. They did not slip on the icy shale near the brook, nor did they show any signs of fatigue on the steep uphill climbs. In several places, the tracks passed directly beneath low, jagged hemlock branches that sat barely 4 feet above the snowline. Yet, there were no broken twigs, no brushed-off snow, and no knee prints. As though the individual had bent their upper torso completely backward or sideways while continuing forward in a seamless, unbroken stride. Isaac followed the line for nearly a mile and a half deep into the wilderness, crossing the boundary markers of the Green Mountain National Forest. The trail eventually led to the base of an old, crumbling stone foundation, the forgotten ruins of a 19th-century timber mill that had burned down in the 1880s. In the center of the snow-covered stone ruins, the footprints abruptly stopped. Isaac stood amidst the frozen limestone blocks, scanning the undisturbed snow around him in a 360-degree circle. There were no tracks leading away. There were no tracks continuing up the mountain ridge. The line simply terminated at the edge of a deep, dark vertical drainage well built from hand-cut fieldstone, descending 10 feet down into the frozen ground. Isaac approached the mouth of the well cautiously, holding the heavy splitting maul ready in his right hand. He leaned over the icy stone ledge and shone his headlamp beam downward into the dark shaft. The bottom of the well was completely dry, covered in a bed of dead brown hemlock needles and rotting wood scraps. Resting in the center of the stone pit was a torn, dirty sleeping bag, several strips of frayed burlap fabric covered in dried mud, and an open, rusted steel tin containing a small, modern handheld GPS unit whose green screen was slowly pulsing with a low battery indicator, Isaac felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The GPS unit had a digital waypoint marked on the map screen. The waypoint coordinates were set to the exact geographical location of Isaac's cabin on Lincoln Gap Road. Isaac stepped back from the stone well, realizing with mounting panic that whoever had lived inside the pit was not a lost wanderer. The individual had tracked his property with deliberate, electronic precision. Isaac did not investigate further. He turned around on his snowshoes and began retracing his steps as fast as his legs could move through the heavy snow, the silence of the winter forest now feeling intensely predatory and hostile. As Isaac climbed back out of the ravine and approached the tree line bordering his own clearing, he noticed something in the snow that made his heart violently skip a beat. Right beside the original single line of burlap-wrapped footprints he had followed into the woods was a second, identical set of fresh tracks. This second set of tracks was heading in the exact opposite direction, traveling out of the deep ravine, moving parallel to his own return path, and breaking into the clearing around his cabin. The snow inside these new impressions was so fresh that small, loose ice crystals were still tumbling into the center of the heel marks. Whoever had made the tracks had not stayed at the old mill ruins. They had been in the woods the entire time, circling behind Isaac through the trees, tracking his movements, and heading straight back toward the clearing while he had been looking down into the stone well. Isaac broke into an exhausting sprint, his snowshoes kicking up plumes of powder as he burst through the hemlock canopy into the open yard, his eyes locked onto the front porch of the cabin. Jasper was no longer sitting on the deck. The heavy wooden front door of the cabin, which Isaac had firmly pulled shut when he walked out into the snow an hour earlier, was standing wide open by 4 inches. The second set of fresh, elongated footprints did not stop in the yard. They ascended the 3 wooden porch steps in clean, single bounds, crossed the cleared deck planks, and led directly over the wooden threshold, disappearing into the dark, warm interior of Isaac's home. Isaac stood at the bottom of the porch stairs, his lungs burning in the sub-zero air, the heavy steel splitting maul trembling in his grip. The silence radiating from inside the cabin was total and suffocating. There was no barking from Jasper, no sound of shifting floorboards, and no movement behind the frosted glass gables of the loft. Isaac kicked off his aluminum snowshoes with 2 quick, fluid motions, leaving them in the snow. He mounted the 3 porch steps in dead silence, keeping his weight over the structural stringers of the wood to avoid any telltale creaks. He reached the front door, wedging his boot against the base of the frame to keep it from swinging open wider. Through the 4-inch gap, a faint, sweet smell drifted out into the cold mountain air. The scent of his own morning coffee mingled with the damp, sour odor of melting snow, wet earth, and unwashed wool. Isaac took a deep breath, raised the heavy splitting maul above his right shoulder, kicked the door wide with his left boot, and stepped inside. The ground floor was cast in deep morning shadows, illuminated only by the gray daylight filtering through the south-facing casement windows. Sitting on the floor in the center of the living room rug, completely unharmed but paralyzed with fear, was Jasper. The dog was staring rigidly up at the open timber staircase that led to the second-floor loft. On the polished pine floorboards between the front entryway and the stairs was a distinct trail of melting, slush, and dark, wet burlap imprints. Isaac moved forward with agonizing slowness, his eyes locked on the edge of the second-floor landing. As he placed his boot on the 3rd stair, a low, mechanical sound broke the silence from the loft above. It was the steady, rhythmic clicking of a computer keyboard. Isaac did not hesitate. He charged up the remaining steps, clearing the landing with the maul raised, his voice cutting through the house like a whip. "Get away from the desk!" Sitting in the ergonomic chair in front of Isaac's 3-monitor cartography workstation was a tall, skeletal man dressed in layers of frayed thermal underwear, his feet wrapped in thick bindings of burlap secured with heavy electrical wire. The man did not run, he did not lunge, he simply stopped typing, swiveled the chair slowly around on its casters, and looked directly into Isaac's eyes with a calm, vacant expression. Resting on his lap was an open, weathered topographical map from 1994, marked with hundreds of tiny red ink dots covering the Green Mountain Wilderness. Isaac kept the heavy steel blade of the maul pointed directly at the man's chest, backing toward the landline terminal on the wall to dial emergency dispatch. Within 40 minutes, 2 Vermont State Police cruisers and a specialized backcountry tactical unit from the Middlesex Barracks arrived on snowmobiles, breaching the gated pass and taking 44-year-old Silas Thorne into custody without resistance. When state police, detectives, and federal land investigators ran Thorne's fingerprints through the National Crime Information Center database, the terrifying truth of the mountain recluse was uncovered. Silas Thorne was a former state environmental surveyor and GIS mapping technician who had vanished from northern New Hampshire in 2016 following a severe psychiatric breakdown and an active warrant for criminal trespass and electronic stalking. Thorne had not been living in society for over 5 years. He had constructed a network of subterranean survival caches across the national forest, using historical topographical charts and stolen handheld GPS units to navigate the rugged wilderness completely off the grid. When Isaac Sterling rented the Lincoln Gap cabin to map the regional drainages, Thorne discovered that Isaac's high-resolution satellite database contained the updated, uncompressed geospatial files for the entire mountain range data that Thorne obsessively believed held the locations of forgotten survey markers from his past career. Thorne had spent 3 weeks observing the cabin from the tree line, memorizing Isaac's morning routines. On the morning of the blizzard, Thorne had deliberately laid down the bizarre, wide-strided footprints leading out toward the old mill ruins, anticipating that a trained cartographer and tracker, like Isaac, would follow the trail into the woods to investigate. The moment Isaac crossed into the ravine, Thorne circled through the dense timber, entered the unlocked cabin to access Isaac's computer workstation, and sat down to download the master mapping files onto a flash drive. Silas Thorne was charged with felony burglary, aggravated stalking, and unlawful entry, and was remanded to a state psychiatric security facility in Berlin, Vermont, for long-term clinical evaluation. Isaac Sterling terminated his lease on Lincoln Gap Road the following week. He relocated his cartography business to a secure, modern apartment in downtown Burlington. But for years afterward, whenever a fresh winter snowfall blanketed the ground outside his window, he never looked at a line of footprints without checking behind him to see where they were leading. In early October of 2017, a 45-year-old lead detective named Ryan Vance was stationed in the small, picturesque coastal town of Camden, Maine. Ryan had spent nearly 2 decades in law enforcement, handling everything from property disputes to seasonal tourist incidents across Knox County. Camden was the kind of idyllic New England harbor town where violent crime was virtually non-existent. People left their front doors unlocked, fishermen greeted shop owners by name along the rocky wharves, and the quiet rhythm of daily life was dictated largely by the changing tides and the arrival of autumn leaf peepers. However, that peace was shattered on the rainy night of the 24th of October 2017, when a prominent local maritime historian and antique book dealer named Gregory Vance vanished without a trace. Gregory was a 72-year-old widower who lived alone in a grand 3-story, cedar-shingled home perched on a granite bluff overlooking Penobscot Bay. He was a creature of absolute habit. Every morning at 7, he walked down to the Harbor Bakery for black coffee, spent his afternoons archiving historical coastal charts in his private study, and dined at the local tavern by 6. When Gregory failed to show up at his bookshop for 2 consecutive days, and his front door was found standing unlocked during a nor'easter, neighbors immediately dialed the Knox County Sheriff Department. Ryan Vance led the investigation from day 1. Inside Gregory's house, detectives found no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, and no indications of a physical struggle. Gregory's wallet, cell phone, passport, and vehicle were all left behind. The only anomaly was Gregory's motorized 22-foot wooden dory, which was missing from its private dock at the base of the granite bluff. 4 days into the massive search, the Coast Guard located the dory drifting aimlessly 12 miles offshore near the rocky shoals of Vinalhaven Island. The vessel was completely intact, the outboard engine was out of fuel, and the ignition key was turned to the run position. Inside the boat, investigators found Gregory's oilskin rain slicker neatly folded on the wooden bench, along with an open thermos of cold tea and a single handwritten note resting on the helm console. The note was brief, written in Gregory's distinctive, elegant fountain pen script. "The tide takes what it gives. I am tired of fighting the cold. Forgive me." Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed the script was a match to Gregory's personal journals. An extensive underwater sonar sweep of the surrounding oceanic trench yielded no body, but given the severe gale force currents, freezing water temperatures, and the clear suicidal note, the Maine State Police and the Knox County coroner officially declared Gregory Vance dead by suicide via drowning. The estate was closed, the antique bookshop was auctioned off to a commercial developer, and the case file was stamped closed, archived into the cold case drawer at the Camden Station by the spring of 2018. For 4 continuous years, the tragedy was treated as a settled, unfortunate chapter in the town's local history. Ryan Vance eventually transitioned from lead criminal investigator to managing administrative operations, watching new files replace the old. Then came the freezing morning of the 14th of November 2022. A brutal early winter blizzard had dumped 10 inches of heavy, wet snow across coastal Maine, knocking out power to several harbor neighborhoods and turning Route 1 into a sheet of gray slush. Ryan arrived at the police station around 7:30 in the morning, carrying a cardboard cup of coffee, shaking the snow from his wool coat. Sitting directly in the center of his desk was the morning mail delivery, sorted by the front desk clerk. Lying on top of the pile of municipal utility notices and interdepartmental memos was a thick, heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with a circular wax stamp of dark red paraffin. The envelope had no printed postage barcode, no postal cancellation mark, and no return address. It had been hand-delivered, slipped directly through the exterior drop slot of the Camden Police Department during the middle of the blizzard overnight. Written across the front of the envelope, in fresh, flowing black India ink, was Ryan's full name and rank, Detective Ryan Vance, Case File 2017-449. Ryan pulled off his gloves and stared at the handwriting. A strange, cold sensation settled in his stomach. The script was unmistakable. The sweeping loops of the capital letters, the precise slant of the vowels, and the sharp terminal strokes were the exact stylistic hallmarks of Gregory Vance, the man officially declared dead 4 years earlier. Ryan grabbed a metal letter opener from his desk drawer, carefully slicing along the top seam of the envelope without disturbing the wax seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavy cotton archival paper, accompanied by a small, rusted brass skeleton key measuring roughly 2 inches in length. Ryan unfolded the paper, smoothed it out across his desk under the fluorescent office lights, and read the letter. The ink was sharp, dark, and completely fresh, smelling faintly of linseed oil and mineral turpentine. The letter read, "Ryan, you looked for me in the deep water because the water was convenient. You read the note on the dory because the words gave you an easy conclusion. You closed the file because the living always prefer an orderly death over an unfinished puzzle." The dory was a decoy. The note was composed under instruction. "I am not beneath the waves of Penobscot Bay. I have not left the peninsula. For 1,847 days, I have been waiting beneath the foundations of the carriage house at 348 High Street. The brass key opens the lower iron grate behind the root cellar shelving. Come alone before the snow melts, or you will only find what the winter preserves." The letter was signed at the bottom, Gregory Vance, the 13th of November, 2022. Ryan sat motionless in his swivel chair, the quiet hum of the station heater suddenly sounding deafening. He read the words 3 times, his pulse quickening with every pass. 348 High Street was the address of Gregory's ancestral property on the bluff. Following the closure of the probate estate in 2019, the primary 3-story house had been purchased by a wealthy family from New York as a summer vacation residence. However, the detached stone and timber carriage house at the rear of the property had remained completely boarded up, unused, and neglected due to severe historical structural preservation covenants. Ryan immediately called the state crime lab in Augusta, requesting an urgent, expedited chemical test on the ink and paper stock, while quietly notifying the on-duty patrol sergeant that he was conducting an immediate field follow-up on a reopened historical lead. He strapped on his service weapon, grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight, tossed a heavy crowbar into the back of his 4-wheel drive department SUV, and drove out through the drifting snow toward the North Bluffs. The drive along High Street was slow and treacherous. The ocean below the cliffs was a churning mass of dark slate-gray water, throwing plumes of white spray against the jagged granite rocks. Ryan pulled up the long, unplowed gravel driveway of 348 High Street at approximately 9:15 in the morning. The main summer house was entirely shuttered for the winter season, its expansive windows covered with dark plywood storm panels. Behind the main residence, half hidden behind towering stands of white pine and frozen hemlock, stood the 2-story carriage house. Its weathered cedar shingles were black with moisture, the roofline sagging under the weight of the fresh snow, and the heavy double wooden barn doors were secured with an old rusted chain and padlock. Ryan pulled his wool watch cap low over his ears, grabbed his flashlight and crowbar, and stepped out into the knee-deep snow. As he walked around the perimeter of the carriage house toward the rear foundation, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. In the fresh snow along the north wall, partially sheltered beneath the wide wooden eaves of the roof, was a distinct set of fresh, deep boot prints. The tracks were crisp, completely unmarred by the morning wind, leading directly toward an exterior wooden bulkhead door set into the fieldstone foundation. The wooden bulkhead doors, which had supposedly been nailed shut during the probate estate closure 4 years ago, were unlatched. The heavy iron hasp hung open, and the door was propped ajar by roughly 2 inches with a flat river stone. Ryan drew his department-issued Glock 22, holding the weapon in his right hand while gripping the tactical flashlight in his left. He used the toe of his heavy winter boot to nudge the bulkhead door open. The hinges screamed in protest, sending a sheet of crusty snow sliding down the wooden planks. A blast of bitterly cold, stale air escaped from the dark cellar void, carrying an overpowering smell of damp lime mortar, wet earth, and the distinct, unmistakable scent of burning paraffin wax. Ryan switched on his tactical light, aiming the wide, powerful beam down the steep flight of slippery wooden cellar steps. He descended slowly, step by deliberate step, his boots crunching over decades of accumulated grit and fallen plaster chips. When he reached the dirt floor of the cellar, he panned the light around the low-ceilinged space. The room was roughly 30 feet square, walled with heavy, unmortared fieldstone. Rows of rotting wooden shelves stood along the perimeter, filled with empty vintage mason jars, rusted gardening tools, and broken window sashes. Ryan walked toward the far back wall where the letter had indicated. Standing against the center fieldstone pier was a massive 6-foot-tall wooden storage shelving unit, completely loaded with discarded stacks of historical maritime journals and brittle nautical charts. Ryan placed his left hand against the frame of the heavy shelf and pulled. The entire unit swung outward smoothly on hidden, heavily greased steel caster wheels set into the dirt, revealing a dark, vertical opening behind the stone wall. Set directly into the granite foundation was a narrow, heavy cast-iron grate measuring 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. In the center of the iron grate was an antique, heavy brass locking mechanism with a keyhole matching the exact shape of the rusted skeleton key resting inside Ryan's coat pocket. Ryan stepped forward, pulled the key from his pocket, and inserted it into the lock. The heavy brass tumblers turned with a sharp, heavy metallic clank that resonated through the subterranean foundation. Ryan pulled the iron grate outward. Behind the grate lay a narrow, dry-walled stone tunnel that descended at a gentle slope directly toward the edge of the granite bluff overlooking the sea. Positioned along the tunnel walls, every 10 feet were small, recessed alcoves holding burning wax candles, their small orange flames flickering gently in the draft. And resting on a rough wooden bench just 15 feet down the illuminated tunnel was a fresh, unopened envelope identical to the one delivered to the police station, pinned to the wood beneath a heavy, brass maritime chronometer whose mechanical balance wheel was ticking with loud, rhythmic precision in the dead silence. Ryan took 2 slow, calculated steps into the candlelit tunnel, his service weapon raised and locked in a 2-handed grip. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the maritime chronometer filled the damp underground passageway, keeping time with the muffled roar of the Atlantic surf crashing against the granite cliffs outside. He reached the wooden bench, kept his eyes sweeping the flickering shadows ahead, and picked up the second envelope with his left hand. He slid his thumb under the flap, breaking the red wax seal. Inside was a single, folded nautical chart of Penobscot Bay, heavily marked with coordinates, along with a brief, handwritten instruction in that same unmistakable black ink. Keep walking to the observation bunker. He is waiting in the chair. Ryan continued down the stone-walled corridor. The air grew progressively colder, carrying a sharp, salty sea mist as the tunnel sloped toward the cliff face. 30 feet further, the passage opened into a vaulted, octagonal chamber built directly inside the natural sea cavern beneath the bluff, a forgotten World War II coastal defense observation post constructed in the early 1940s. A wide, horizontal, concrete observation slit looked directly out over the boiling gray waters of the bay. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by the cold, pale daylight filtering through the slit, sat an antique wooden armchair facing the ocean. Sitting upright in the chair was the figure of an elderly man, dressed in a heavy wool peacoat, dark canvas trousers, and leather boots, his head resting slightly back against the high wooden frame. Ryan moved forward cautiously, his flashlight beam pinning the figure in harsh white light. "Police! Keep your hands where I can see them!" There was no movement, no breath, no response. Ryan approached the side of the chair, his fingers pressing against the cold skin of the man's neck. There was no pulse. The man was Gregory Vance. His body was completely intact, frozen solid in the sub-freezing coastal air, preserved by the natural cold storage of the subterranean bunker. But forensic examination of his skin and the surrounding dust revealed something that defied all medical logic. Gregory had not passed away 5 years ago in 2017. He had died less than 48 hours earlier. Resting on Gregory's lap was a portable microcassette recorder wired with an external lapel microphone, alongside a thick spiral dossier stamped with property transfer deeds and banking records. Ryan clicked the playback button on the recorder. A raspy, labored voice, cracked with age and exhaustion, yet unmistakably that of Gregory Vance, began to speak through the small speaker. "Ryan, if you are hearing this, the final letter reached your desk in time. For 5 years, I did not live. I was kept down here. In October of 2017, I discovered that the developer managing the Municipal Harbor Reclamation Project was systematically liquidating protected coastal parcels through forged historical deeds. When I confronted him with the original colonial charters from my archive, he did not kill me. He knew that an unsolved murder would draw state police scrutiny and freeze the land titles in probate. He forced me to write that suicide note under duress, drove my dory out to Vinyl Haven to stage my drowning, and locked me in this bunker beneath the carriage house. He brought food once a week. He kept me alive only because my signature was required on staggered trust distributions that unlocked $30 million in commercial harbor assets over a 5-year vesting cycle. 2 nights ago, the final vesting period concluded. He brought the last document for me to sign, and he left me here without heat or provisions to let the winter finish the job. He did not know I had spent 40 months carving a loose stone out of the drainage flue to reach the upper carriage house, or that I had kept this archival paper hidden in the wall. I wrote the letter with the last of my strength and walked it to your station before the blizzard trapped me. Everything you need to convict him is in this dossier. The recording clicked off with a sharp mechanical snap. Ryan stood in the freezing bunker, his jaw clenched, staring at the detailed corporate ledgers resting on Gregory's knees. The developer, named throughout the documents, the man who had orchestrated the abduction, forged the historical land sales, and visited the hidden bunker under the cover of darkness for 5 years, was Marcus Sterling, a prominent Camden City Council member and the head of the Regional Planning Commission. Ryan called in immediate tactical backup. Within 2 hours, state police units surrounded Marcus Sterling's waterfront estate in Rockport, arresting him just as he was loading luggage into his vehicle to board an international flight out of Boston. Forensic units searching Sterling's home recovered the master keys to the carriage house bulkhead, matching carbon paper used to trace Gregory's signatures, and surveillance equipment used to monitor the Bluff property. The case that had sat stamped closed as a tragic suicide in 2017 was formally reopened and converted to charges of aggravated kidnapping, financial fraud, and first-degree murder. Marcus Sterling was convicted in Knox County Superior Court and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gregory Vance was finally laid to rest with full honors in the historic coastal cemetery overlooking the bay he had dedicated his life to preserving, closing the final, terrifying chapter of the mystery letter that refused to let the truth stay buried in the dark. In the early morning hours of the 17th of November 2022, a 36-year-old emergency communications specialist named Kendra Walsh was working the graveyard shift at the Regional Public Safety Answering Point in Flathead County, Montana. The Dispatch Communications Center was located inside a secure, subterranean concrete facility on the southern outskirts of Kalispell. It was a sterile, windowless room filled with the constant, low-frequency hum of server racks, the soft tapping of mechanical keyboards, and the glow of multi-monitor arrays displaying geographical mapping software, automated vehicle locators, and prioritized call queues. Kendra was an exceptionally experienced veteran dispatcher. Over 12 years on the console, she had processed thousands of emergency calls, ranging from catastrophic winter highway pileups along Highway 93 to backcountry wildlife encounters, structure fires, and high-tension domestic disturbances. She was known among her supervisors and the county sheriff deputies for her absolute composure under extreme stress. Kendra had a rare ability to keep her voice level, calm, and methodical, grounding hysterical callers and extracting vital tactical information when every second mattered. The night of November 16th, heading into the morning of the 17th, was unusually harsh. A fierce Pacific Northwest cold front had pushed over the Rocky Mountains, triggering a severe winter storm warning. By 2 in the morning, heavy sleet had turned into blinding, wind-driven snow, dumping nearly 10 inches across the valley floor and dropping ambient temperatures down to 11 degrees. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen timberlands, snapping pine branches and creating drifting conditions that slowed emergency vehicle response times to a crawl. Kendra was covering the primary emergency intake console alongside 2 other night shift dispatchers. Her personal life, much like her work life, was centered on quiet stability. Kendra lived alone in a restored, single-story craftsman bungalow on a secluded, 2-acre wooded lot off Foothill Road, approximately 9 miles east of downtown Kalispell, nestled near the base of the Swan Mountain Range. The house was bordered by dense stands of western larch, lodgepole pine, and an expansive apple orchard that had grown wild and unmanaged for decades. Because her property sat far back from the main county road and had no immediate neighbors within sight, Kendra had invested in a comprehensive, hardwired smart home perimeter security setup, complete with heavy deadbolts, motion-activated floodlights, and battery-backed interior cameras that she could monitor directly from her smartphone. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, an incoming emergency line illuminated the center console with a sharp, pulsing red icon. The computerized telephony system flagged the call as coming from an unlisted, temporary VoIP cellular number with an unstable triangulation ping bouncing between two regional cellular towers in the East Valley foothills. Kendra pressed the intake button on her headset, adjusted her microphone, and delivered the standard, practiced opening. Flathead County 911, where is your emergency? For the first 4 seconds, there was no verbal response over the line. All Kendra could hear was a faint, shallow breathing pattern, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic scratching sound that suggested the caller was holding the phone close to heavy canvas fabric. Kendra repeated the prompt, her voice firm and clear. 911, I have an open line. Can you tell me your location? Are you in danger? A voice finally responded. It was a woman's voice, but it was strained, raspy, and dropped to an agonizingly low whisper, trembling with sheer, visceral terror. Help me, please. The whisper came through the headset, cracking slightly. He cut the power to the circuit box outside. The whole place is dark. Kendra's hands immediately flew across her mechanical keyboard, entering the priority distress ticket, initiating an active cellular trace request to the service carrier, and flagging the on-duty patrol sergeant for the Eastern County sector. Ma'am, stay on the line with me, Kendra said, her tone steady and reassuring. I am getting help to you right now. Can you tell me your address or a nearby landmark? I don't know the house number, the caller whispered, her breath hitching as if she were hiding in a confined space. It is a rental out in the trees off the foothill road. I am trapped in the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. He is already inside the structure. Kendra's fingers paused on the keys for a split second. A cold, subtle prickle of unease ran down her forearms, but she instantly brushed it aside, focusing on her training protocols. Foothill Road was a long, winding, rural route with dozens of older homesteads, rental properties, and cabins scattered throughout the timber. Can you describe the layout of the property, ma'am? Kendra asked, typing rapidly. Where is the intruder right now? He walked up the long gravel driveway by the orchard, the caller whispered, the words coming in short, choked gasps. He bypassed the front porch with the fieldstone pillars and the green wooden bench. He went around to the rear mudroom where the cellar bulkhead is. Kendra sat entirely rigid in her high-backed ergonomic chair. Her heart gave a sharp, violent thud against her ribs. Fieldstone pillars, a green wooden bench on the front porch, a rear mudroom beside an exterior cellar bulkhead. That was not a generic description of a mountain rental property. That was the exact, unique architectural layout of Kendra's own house on Foothill Road. Kendra had personally built that green wooden bench from reclaimed cedar planks the previous summer, placing it between the two fieldstone pillars her father had laid 30 years earlier. Kendra felt a cold wave of disorientation wash over her, the sterile, brightly lit dispatch room suddenly feeling uncomfortably far away. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing her voice to remain entirely professional, though her throat felt tight. Ma'am, are you certain you are in a rental? Who is the owner of the property? I don't know. The caller breathed, her voice breaking into a suppressed sob. I was staying here. He followed me from the highway. Please, you have to hurry. He is wearing heavy rubber pack boots. He is walking across the oak floors in the living room right now. He just bumped into the cast iron coat rack by the grandfather clock. Kendra's blood ran completely cold. In Kendra's living room, positioned immediately beside the front entryway, stood an antique, heavy cast iron coat rack that sat directly adjacent to an 8-foot grandfather clock inherited from her grandmother. There was no mistake. The caller was not describing a similar house down the road. The caller was describing the interior of Kendra's private residence in real time, in the middle of a sub-zero winter blizzard. Kendra's hand trembled slightly as she reached across her desk, pulling her personal smartphone from its charging cradle. She unlocked the screen, opened her private security system application, and tapped the master dashboard. The mobile screen displayed a red banner across the top. System offline, primary AC power lost at 3:08 a.m. Battery backup active. The security cameras were running on low-power local storage, unable to broadcast live video feeds over the home's disabled Wi-Fi network. Kendra looked up at the large dispatch monitor, keying the priority emergency frequency to the patrol deputies on duty. "All units, this is Dispatcher 4, Kendra stated, her voice tighter than usual, fighting to maintain her professional delivery. "I have an active home invasion in progress at 4790 Foothill Road. Suspect is confirmed inside the residence. Caller is barricaded in the northwest guest bedroom. Suspect is mobile on the ground floor. Stage out with Code 3 response." The radio cracked back immediately as Deputy Marcus Cole acknowledged the transmission. "Copy that. 4. Unit 12 is en route from Creston. Road conditions are heavy ice. Estimated arrival time is 8 to 10 minutes. 10 minutes. In an active home invasion, 10 minutes was an eternity. Kendra returned her full attention to the 911 audio channel, pressing her headset ear cup firmly against her ear. "Ma'am, I have deputies rolling to your location right now," Kendra whispered into her microphone, her voice carrying an intense, urgent gravity. "Listen to me very carefully. Is the guest bedroom door locked?" "Yes," the caller replied, her voice trembling so hard the words were barely audible. "But the latch is old. It's a skeleton key lock. It won't hold if he throws his weight against it." Kendra's chest tightened to the point of pain. The guest bedroom in her bungalow had an original 1920s mortise lock with an antique brass skeleton keyhole, a detail that nobody outside of her immediate family could possibly know. "Where are you hiding in that room?" Kendra asked, trying to visualize every corner of the bedroom. Inside the built-in cedar armoire, behind the extra winter quilts, the caller whispered. Kendra's mind raced. The built-in armoire was recessed directly into the wall framing of that room, deep enough for an adult to sit concealed behind the heavy wool blankets stored on the bottom shelf. "Can you hear where he is now?" Kendra asked. The caller went completely silent for several seconds. Through the line, the acoustic clarity of the call shifted. The background static seemed to drop away, replaced by the distinct, heavy sound of slow, unhurried footsteps dragging across hardwood floorboards. "Creak! Creak! Creak! He is in the hallway." The caller wept quietly. He stopped outside the bathroom. Now he is right outside the bedroom door. Kendra stared at the timer on her console screen. The call had been active for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Deputy Cole was still at least 6 minutes away, fighting through the drifting snow on Foothill Road. "Ma'am," Kendra said, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative command, "if he breaches that door, do not stay in the armoire. The window behind the bed has a slide latch. You can drop onto the porch roof." The caller did not respond to the instruction. Instead, the sound of a heavy metal object scraping against wood came through the headset line, followed by the slow, distinct squeak of old brass hinges swinging open into an empty room. "He's in the bedroom." The caller breathed, the audio picking up the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a second person entering the space. "He is looking under the bed." Kendra felt tears of pure terror and adrenaline welling in her eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the dispatch console. Then, over the open 911 audio feed, the heavy footsteps stopped completely. A long, suffocating silence hung over the line for 5 full seconds. Then, from the other end of the connection, the voice that spoke was no longer a trembling, frantic whisper from an unknown woman hiding in the closet. The voice was deep, slow, and completely calm, speaking with cold, chilling familiarity directly into the receiver, right from the center of Kendra's bedroom. "Hello, Kendra. You always told people on the radio that help was only minutes away. Let's see if your deputies get here before I check behind the quilts." Kendra did not freeze. The sound of that man's voice speaking her name inside her own home, mocking the very emergency system she had dedicated 12 years of her life to operating, triggered an immediate, cold clarity. There was no terrified victim trapped in the cedar armoire. The entire 911 call had been an elaborate, calculated lure staged by the intruder himself using a burner phone and a digital pitch modulator application to keep Kendra locked on the console, listening to her own violation in real time. Kendra did not reply over the line. She did not give him the satisfaction of hearing her panic. She kept the 911 channel open, pinned the audio monitor to the countywide emergency broadcast feed, and clicked her radio transmission button with a steady hand. Unit 12, this is Dispatcher 4, Kendra stated, her voice flat, sharp, and razor-focused. Suspect is confirmed inside the structure, actively transmitting on the primary emergency queue. Suspect is armed, aware of your response, and holding in the northwest bedroom. Do not approach the front gravel lane. Approach on foot from the orchard along the south tree line. Breaching authorization granted immediately upon arrival. Deputy Marcus Cole keyed his radio instantly. Copy that, 4. 2 minutes out. Turning off light bars at the intersection. Over the open phone line, the intruder chuckled softly into the receiver. The heavy sound of footsteps moved across the guest bedroom floorboards, heading toward the living room windows that faced the front lane. He was looking out into the blizzard, expecting the flashing red and blue strobes of approaching cruisers to give him ample warning. Because Kendra had routed the deputies through the unplowed orchard in total blackout mode, the intruder never saw them coming. At 3:23 in the morning, Deputy Cole and a second backup unit breached the rear mudroom door with a heavy battering ram, the oak frame splintering with a thunderous crack that echoed over the open dispatch headset. Deputies swept through the kitchen and hallway with weapon-mounted lights blazing, shouting commands, "Sheriff Department, get on the ground! Show your hands!" Over the 911 call audio, Kendra heard the sudden scuffle of heavy boots on the hardwood floor, a brief, violent struggle, and the loud clatter of a heavy steel crowbar hitting the floorboards, followed by the sharp, metallic ratcheting of handcuffs. Deputy Cole keyed his radio, breathing heavily. Dispatch, suspect in custody. Scene is secure. House is clear. Kendra slowly released her grip on the desk, letting out a long, trembling breath as her colleagues in the dispatch room gathered around her console. When investigators processed the suspect and ran his identity through state and federal law enforcement databases, the chilling, obsessive reality behind the home invasion was brought to light. The man was 41-year-old Thomas Ray Sterling, a former volunteer auxiliary firefighter and tow truck operator who had been convicted of felony stalking and electronic harassment 5 years earlier in Missoula. Sterling had developed an unhealthy, fixation-driven obsession with Kendra's calm, authoritative voice after hearing her coordinate multiple complex highway rescue dispatches over the open public emergency scanner channels. He had spent over 6 months monitoring her shifts, tracking her vehicle from the dispatch facility, and mapping the perimeter of her secluded property on Foothill Road. Sterling had cut the main power box to disable the Wi-Fi cameras, used a stolen master key to enter through the cellar bulkhead, and placed the staged 911 call using a voice modulation tool specifically to force Kendra into handling the emergency herself, planning to ambuscade the deputies upon arrival and force a catastrophic standoff. Sterling was formally indicted in Flathead County District Court on charges of felony burglary, aggravated stalking, wiretapping, and reckless endangerment of emergency personnel. In mid-2023, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 35 years in the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge without the possibility of early parole. Kendra took a 3-week administrative leave, reinforced her property with hardwired off-grid security systems, and returned to her dispatch console the following month. She continued to answer emergency calls with that same calm, unshakable composure, knowing better than anyone that when terror strikes in the dark, steady discipline and swift action are the only things standing between survival and disaster. In late October of 2021, a married couple in their early 30s, Ethan and Maya Caldwell, closed on an idyllic two-story Tudor-style rental home in the quiet, wooded suburbs of Lake Forest, Illinois. Ethan was an independent risk analyst for an insurance firm in Chicago, while Maya worked remotely as a botanical illustrator for regional academic journals. With the birth of their first child expected in the coming spring, they were desperate to trade their congested urban loft for space, tranquility, and a large yard. The house sat at the dead end of a winding residential lane lined with towering black walnut trees and dense thickets of buckthorn. Built in the late 1930s, the structure possessed magnificent leaded glass casement windows, original dark oak timbering, and a steep gabled roofline that looked straight out of a classic architectural magazine. The landlord, an elderly real estate investor who spent his winters in Florida, had offered the lease at a substantial discount, citing the older boiler heating system and the minor maintenance requirements typical of historic Midwestern homes. For the first few weeks, the Caldwells felt an overwhelming sense of domestic peace. The house was drafty, but Ethan kept the brick fireplace roaring in the living room every evening. Upstairs, they set up their master bedroom, an open-concept art studio for Maya, and a nursery that Ethan was actively painting in warm, pale yellow tones. The air throughout the house smelled of beeswax polish, dry oak lath, and wood ash, a nostalgic, comforting scent that made the property feel safe. However, as November arrived and the first bitter sleet storms swept across Lake Michigan, an irritating disturbance surfaced along the second-floor ceiling. It began on the night of November 12th, around 1:15 in the morning. Ethan was lying awake in bed, reading financial reports on his tablet, when a faint, dry sound emerged from the ceiling corner directly above Maya's side of the bed. It was a light, erratic scratching, accompanied by the muffled scuttle of tiny claws moving across dry plaster. Ethan nudged Maya awake, but by the time she opened her eyes, the sound had faded into the silence of the night. Ethan smiled, reassuring his wife that the cold weather was simply driving field mice or black roof rats into the eaves of the attic to nest near the warm chimney stack. Having grown up in rural Wisconsin, Ethan was well acquainted with the seasonal habits of woodland rodents. The next morning, Ethan drove down to the local hardware store on Western Avenue and purchased half a dozen heavy-duty snap traps, several boxes of rodent bait blocks, and 2 cans of expanding polyurethane foam. He pulled down the attic access ladder located in the hallway closet, poked his head into the dark, dusty crawl space, and scattered the baited traps across the exposed fiberglass insulation, making sure to seal a few small gaps along the exterior soffits. For 3 days, the scratching stopped completely, and Ethan congratulated himself on solving the problem quickly. Then, on the freezing night of November 19th, the scratching returned with an unsettling intensity. Around 2:30 in the morning, Maya sat bolt upright in bed, gasping as a loud, rhythmic, rasping sound echoed directly behind the drywall of the nursery next door. It did not sound like the frantic, light skittering of a quarter-pound field mouse. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate, sounding like a blunt nail or a thick wire being dragged rhythmically along the wooden lath strips. Ethan got out of bed, grabbed a heavy metal flashlight, and walked into the unfinished nursery. He pressed his ear flat against the yellow plaster wall. Beneath the paint, he could distinctly hear something moving inside the partition cavity. But what chilled Ethan was the cadence. The scratching would scrape 5 times, pause for exactly 3 seconds, and then scrape 5 times again, repeating with mechanical, almost rhythmic precision. Ethan tapped hard on the drywall with his knuckles to scare whatever creature was inside. The moment his knuckles struck the plaster, the wall tapped back. 3 sharp, heavy raps from inside the hollow cavity, directly level with Ethan's chest. Ethan stepped backward, his heart leaping into his throat. He tried to convince himself that a trapped raccoon or a large opossum had crawled down from the attic and was simply reacting in defense against the wall framing. The following afternoon, Ethan called a local licensed wildlife removal specialist named Carl Hatcher to conduct a comprehensive structural sweep of the attic, chimney, and perimeter foundations. Carl was a veteran exterminator with 30 years of experience handling animal intrusions across the North Shore. He arrived in a white utility van, strapped on heavy leather gloves, grabbed an industrial inspection borescope camera, and spent nearly 3 hours scouring the property from top to bottom. When Carl climbed down from the hallway ceiling hatch, he pulled off his dust mask and looked at Ethan with an expression of complete professional bewilderment. Carl explained that there was not a single trace of rodent or raccoon activity anywhere in the attic. There were no droppings, no shredded insulation nests, no chewed electrical wiring, and every single snap trap Ethan had laid out was still fully set with the bait completely untouched. Furthermore, the borescope camera showed that all exterior chimney flashing and roof vents were completely sealed with heavy galvanized wire mesh, making it physically impossible for any wild animal larger than an insect to penetrate the roofline. Carl packed his gear, shook his head, and suggested that perhaps the old cast iron steam pipes inside the radiator system were expanding and contracting against the wooden floor joists as the boiler cycled on and off, creating a scraping resonance that mimicked animal movement. Ethan desperately wanted to believe the steam pipe theory. But over the following 2 weeks, from late November into early December 2021, the atmosphere inside the Lake Forest house deteriorated into pure psychological dread. Small, unsettling occurrences began to manifest around the living quarters. Maya would find the kitchen pantry door unlatched and standing slightly ajar in the mornings, despite having secured it the night before. A small silver baby rattle, a gift from Maya's mother sitting on the nursery dresser, vanished without a trace, only to turn up 3 days later, sitting upright on the bottom step of the basement stairs. Maya became convinced that the house was afflicted by something unnatural. She began suffering from severe insomnia, terrified of the oppressive, heavy silence that settled over the second floor whenever Ethan was downstairs. She repeatedly told Ethan that whenever she sat in the nursery painting her botanical studies during the afternoon, she could feel a cold, faint draft brushing across her ankles, accompanied by the distinct, sickening smell of wet, sour wool and old copper. The climax of the terror occurred on the stormy night of the 14th of December 2021. A violent winter blizzard swept across Lake County, bringing sustained gale force winds, blinding snowfall, and freezing rain that snapped tree branches and knocked out municipal power across the entire neighborhood around 10 in the evening. The house plunged into pitch blackness, the radiators groaning as the electric boiler shut down, causing the interior temperature to plummet rapidly into the high 40s. Ethan lit several thick candles, placed them in ceramic bowls around the master bedroom, and urged Maya to bundle under several heavy down comforters to stay warm. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan was awoken by a sound that made every hair on his arms stand on end. It was not the wind howling against the gables. It was that same dry, abrasive scratching sound. But this time, it was not muffled behind lath and plaster. It was completely open, loud, and immediate, originating from directly beneath their heavy wooden bed frame. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. Ethan lay entirely frozen under the blankets, his eyes wide in the dim, flickering orange candlelight. Maya was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Ethan slowly slid his hand toward the edge of the mattress, reaching down to where his heavy tactical flashlight sat on the nightstand. His fingers curled around the knurled metal barrel. He clicked the tail switch, sending a blinding white LED beam cutting across the dark bedroom. Ethan took a deep, silent breath, rolled toward the edge of the mattress, and lowered the flashlight over the side, shining the high-powered beam directly into the dark void beneath the bed frame. The space beneath the bed was empty. There were only 2 plastic underbed storage bins and a pair of Maya's fleece slippers. Ethan let out a long, trembling breath of relief, resting his forehead against the wooden bedrail. Then, right at the edge of his peripheral vision, something caught his eye against the dark oak floorboards. In the center of the hardwood floor directly beneath the bed, the antique floral area rug had been shifted back by several inches, exposing a section of bare floorboards that Ethan had never seen before. Set flush into the oak planks was an old, rectangular cold air return iron vent grate, measuring roughly 12 inches wide by 24 inches long. The 4 heavy, flathead steel screws that secured the cast iron decorative grate to the floor framing had been cleanly extracted, sitting neatly in a small, organized row on the polished wood beside the opening. And resting right inside the dark galvanized ductwork shaft directly beneath the removed grate was a small, familiar silver object glinting in the LED light, the missing baby rattle. Ethan felt a surge of pure adrenaline freeze his blood. He leaned down lower, pointing the flashlight directly down into the vertical cold air return duct that dropped straight through the interior wall cavity toward the basement furnace trunk lines below. The beam of light traveled down the metal shaft, illuminating a series of small, custom-welded steel climbing rungs that had been anchored directly into the sheet metal walls of the ductwork at 12-inch intervals. And looking up from the dark bend of the duct shaft, 15 feet down inside the central heating core of the house, Ethan saw a pair of human hands, pale, heavily calloused, with fingernails worn down to raw, ragged edges gripping the metal rungs, accompanied by the slow, raspy sound of human breath echoing upward through the vents. Ethan did not scream. He did not freeze. The primal urge to protect his pregnant wife and unborn child took over his entire body in a fraction of a second. Ethan dropped the flashlight onto the rug, grabbed the heavy, solid oak nightstand with both hands, and flipped the 100-pound piece of furniture upside down directly over the open duct vent, slamming the heavy timber down against the iron framing with a concussive crash. From inside the duct shaft, directly beneath the oak wood, a frantic, muffled scraping erupted, followed by 2 violent, concussive thuds against the underside of the floorboards as whoever was climbing the metal rungs slammed their fists upward against the barricade. Ethan leaped onto the bed, shook Maya violently awake, and yelled at her to get up immediately. Maya opened her eyes in a terrified panic, seeing the sheer, wild terror on her husband's face. Ethan grabbed her winter coat, threw it over her shoulders, dragged her out of the master bedroom, and bolted down the dark second-floor hallway. They took the stairs, 3 at a time, burst out through the front entryway into the freezing blizzard, and ran straight across the knee-deep snow toward Ethan's all-wheel drive SUV parked in the driveway. Ethan slammed Maya into the passenger seat, jumped behind the wheel, locked all 4 doors, and hit the ignition. He threw the transmission into reverse, spun the tires through the heavy slush, and tore down the residential lane onto Western Avenue, screaming into his phone as he dialed 911. Within 12 minutes, 5 squad cars from the Lake Forest Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff Department arrived at the dead-end lane, surrounding the Tudor residence with high-powered searchlights and weapons drawn. Tactical officers breached the front door, sweeping through the dark ground floor before advancing upstairs to secure the master bedroom. The overturned nightstand remained firmly in place over the open-air vent, but the sounds from beneath had stopped entirely. Officers moved the nightstand and lowered a fiber-optic tactical camera down into the galvanized return shaft. The duct was empty, but the custom-welded steel climbing rungs extended all the way down through the core of the house, leading directly into the main mechanical plenum above the decommissioned 1930s coal furnace in the deepest section of the stone basement. Tactical teams descended into the basement, clearing through rows of old timber framing and disused coal bins. Inside the cavernous, hollow sheet metal interior of the old industrial heating furnace, officers uncovered a fully functional, insulated living habitat. The interior of the vintage furnace had been lined with layers of acoustic foam and wool blankets. Inside was a sleeping cot, an unlit propane camping heater, dozens of opened ration cans, a pair of night vision binoculars, and a battery-powered shortwave scanner tuned directly to the local emergency police frequencies. Pinned to the metal walls of the furnace were dozens of detailed, hand-drawn blueprints of the house's entire internal structural cavities, along with handwritten observation charts detailing Ethan and Maya's daily schedules, their sleep cycles, and the projected due date of their baby. An exterior basement coal chute window was found kicked open from the inside, leading out into the dark woods behind the property. K9 tracking teams swept through the snow-covered buckthorn thickets, tracking a fresh scent trail through the blizzard to a detached private carriage house 3 doors down the lane. There, hiding in the unheated loft above a private garage, police arrested 42-year-old Warren Gable. When investigators ran Gable's fingerprints and history through regional databases, the terrifying, unbelievable truth of the Lake Forest house came into full focus. Warren Gable was the estranged adult son of the elderly property owner who spent his winters in Florida. Warren was a licensed HVAC technician and metal fabricator who had lived in the house as a child. When his father began leasing out the property to rotating tenants years prior, Warren refused to let go of the family estate. Using his professional knowledge of structural heating systems, Warren had systematically modified the massive, disused gravity-fed heating trunk lines during a previous vacancy, welding internal ladders, and carving access panels behind baseboard grates to turn the entire interior wall network into a private, hidden transit system. He did not live in the house full-time. He used his father's spare keys to slip into the basement during the winter months, living inside the furnace and moving through the ductwork while tenants slept above him. The scratching sounds that had terrorized Ethan and Maya for weeks had not been rats, mice, or expanding steam pipes. They were the sounds of Warren Gable slowly and methodically unscrewing the ventilation grates from the inside using a small flathead pocket tool, testing how far he could extend his upper body into the living quarters without alerting the residents. The rhythmic tapping Ethan had heard in the nursery had been Warren tapping his tool against the tin duct to measure the sound resonance of the empty room. Warren Gable was charged and convicted in Lake County Circuit Court on multiple felony counts of home invasion, stalking, residential burglary, and criminal trespass, receiving a 20-year sentence in state prison. Ethan and Maya broke their lease immediately, moved into a modern, single-story ranch home in southern Wisconsin, and welcomed a healthy baby girl the following spring. Ethan had every single heating vent in their new home inspected, reinforced, and bolted with tamper-proof security steel, knowing firsthand that the terrifying sounds in the walls are sometimes not animals at all, but a human being watching you from the dark. The appeal of amateur spelunking, or cave exploring, is that it allows regular people to become true pioneers. In a world where almost every square inch of the surface has been mapped by satellites, the deep underground remains one of the last places on Earth where you can step into a room where no human eye has ever looked before. But for 29-year-old high school biology teacher Brandon Cole, a weekend trip into the rugged wilderness of eastern Kentucky in the spring of 2022 would turn into a stark reminder of why some spaces were left unmapped. He would discover that being the first person to enter a cave doesn't mean you are the only thing inside it. The setting for this story is the Daniel Boone National Forest, a massive expanse of dense woods, steep sandstone cliffs, and thousands of hidden limestone sinkholes. It was the 23rd of April 2022, a damp, foggy Saturday where the spring rain had finally stopped. But the forest floor remained soaked, smelling heavily of wet moss, decaying leaves, and cold mud. Brandon was not a reckless adventurer. He was a methodical, careful guy who spent his free time documenting wild orchid species and mapping minor cave entrances for a local conservation group. He was incredibly fit, carried top-of-the-line gear, and always let the local ranger station know his general coordinates before heading out. Around 1:30 p.m., Brandon was navigating a steep, rocky ravine about 4 miles off the main hiking trail when he noticed a strange anomaly in the hillside. Hidden behind a thick curtain of tangled wild blackberry briars and overgrown ferns was a narrow horizontal fissure in the limestone rock. The opening was only about 3 feet wide, but a steady, surprisingly cold blast of air was blowing out from the darkness inside, indicating that the fissure connected to a substantial underground chamber. Brandon felt that familiar surge of excitement. He pulled out his rugged digital camera, turned on his primary high-powered headlamp, and dropped to his knees. He slid his backpack ahead of him, maneuvering his torso through the tight, muddy gap. The rock was sharp, tearing at his canvas jacket, but after a few yards of tight crawling, the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward. He stood up, brushing the wet clay from his knees, and shined his light around. He was standing in a majestic, pristine limestone cavern that dropped down at a sharp angle. The air was dead, heavy, and incredibly crisp, registering at a constant 55 degrees. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ping of water droplets falling from distant stalactites and hitting the stone floor somewhere in the dark. For the next 2 hours, Brandon moved deeper into the cave system, completely fascinated. He followed a dry, ancient underground riverbed that twisted and turned through 3 massive chambers, each one larger than the last. He took dozens of high-definition photos of rare geological formations, his camera flash exploding with brilliant bursts of white light that briefly illuminated the ancient stone walls before plunging them back into the blue-white beam of his headlamp. At exactly 3:42 p.m., Brandon reached what appeared to be the absolute end of the cave system. He entered a long, narrow gallery that resembled a subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the walls tapered inward until they terminated in a solid, vertical wall of jagged limestone. Brandon walked to the very back of the gallery, stopping about 10 feet away from the terminal wall. He set his backpack down on the pebbles, pulled out a fresh bottle of water, and decided to take one final panoramic photograph of the room before starting the long trek back to the surface. He raised his heavy DSLR camera to his eye, dialed the shutter speed down to allow for a long exposure, and pressed the button. The powerful external strobe flash mounted on top of the camera popped with a deafening electric crack, illuminating the entire back wall of the cave with a light as bright as the midday sun. The light vanished instantly, returning the room to the narrow beam of his headlamp. Brandon smiled, looking down at the small LCD preview screen on the back of his camera to check the exposure of the shot. As the digital image rendered on the screen, Brandon's breath caught sharply in his throat. The photograph was crystal clear. It showed the smooth pebble floor, the dark limestone walls, and the vertical rock face at the dead end. But standing precisely in the far left corner of the terminal wall, completely hidden within a deep shadow that his headlamp had missed, was a shape. It wasn't a rock formation. The geometry was entirely wrong. It was a towering, skeletal figure, standing well over 6.5 feet tall. The entity was completely naked, its skin a dull, bruised gray color that looked slick, oily, and completely hairless. It was pressed tight into the corner, its long, emaciated limbs folded inward against its torso like a compressed insect. But what made Brandon's blood run completely cold was its posture. The creature's neck was unnaturally elongated, its head tilted downward at a horrific 90-degree angle, staring directly across the empty room toward the camera lens. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the camera flash had caught the distinct white reflection of 2 massive glassy orbs. Brandon stood perfectly paralyzed in the silent gallery, the small screen of the camera illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. His logical mind tried to reject it. He told himself it was an optical illusion, a strange combination of iron deposits and shadows on the limestone wall. He slowly raised his head, his hands shaking violently as he directed the bright blue-white beam of his headlamp toward the far left corner of the back wall. The corner was empty. There was nothing but jagged gray stone and a small pool of shadow. Brandon let out a ragged, trembling breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He reached down to pick up his water bottle, his eyes still fixed on the empty corner. Then, the dead silence of the subterranean gallery was broken by a sound. It didn't come from the ceiling, and it didn't come from the tunnel behind him. It came from directly inside the solid limestone wall in the back of the cave. It was a low, dry, rhythmic scraping sound, like heavy bone dragging slowly across rough concrete. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. And as Brandon watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, a narrow vertical crack in the stone wall, a fissure that was barely 4 inches wide, began to flex. The solid limestone groaned under an immense, impossible pressure, and a long, pale, multi-jointed finger, ending in a sharp black claw, slowly pushed out from the darkness inside the mountain. The single, pale finger hooked around the edge of the narrow rock crack, its black claw digging into the soft limestone with enough force to send a small shower of white stone dust clattering down onto the river pebbles below. Brandon could not look away. The sheer, overwhelming terror felt like a physical weight crushing his chest, freezing the air inside his lungs. He stood completely still, his headlamp trembling so badly that the beam of light danced erratically across the back wall of the cave, while his brain desperately tried to process the physical impossibility of what he was witnessing. A 4-inch crack in solid stone cannot accommodate a living creature. But then the limestone groaned again, a deep, vibrating bass sound that resonated right through the soles of Brandon's boots. A second finger emerged, then a third. The long, multi-jointed hands began to pull the edges of the vertical fissure apart. The rock wasn't breaking, it was flexing, shifting like clay under an immense, unnatural pressure from the other side. Slowly, the smooth, hairless crown of a pale gray skull began to push through the gap. The skin was slick and wet, glistening under the blue-white beam of the headlamp, completely free of any blood or tissue, despite the razor-sharp edges of the stone scraping against it. The entity was unhinging its own skeletal structure, compressing its ribs and shoulders flat to slip through a space no wider than a book. As the top half of the creature's face cleared the rock, its 2 massive, glassy black orbs snapped into focus. They didn't blink. They didn't adjust to the bright light. They locked instantly onto Brandon, absorbing the headlamp's glare like twin pools of ink. Its unhinged jaw slid open, and from deep within its elongated throat came a low, wet, rhythmic chattering sound, the dry clicking of bone rubbing against bone. The clicking sound echoed off the narrow walls of the gallery, magnifying until it sounded like hundreds of insects crawling inside Brandon's own ears. That sound broke Brandon's paralysis. He didn't grab his backpack. He didn't check his water bottle. He spun around on his heel, his heavy boots skidding wildly against the smooth river pebbles, and bolted down the narrow subway-like tunnel, running blindly back toward the mouth of the cave. The gallery was pitch black behind him, illuminated only by the frantic, bouncing beam of his headlamp as he ran. He sprinted through the first massive chamber, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The air in the cave, which had felt crisp and refreshing hours earlier, now felt suffocating, smelling heavily of ancient, stagnant mud and iron. Behind him, from the darkness of the tunnel he had just abandoned, came a terrifyingly fast sound. It wasn't a running stride. It was a heavy, 4-legged scrambling, a rapid succession of wet, solid impacts against the stone floor. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving with an insect-like velocity, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks at a speed no human could ever match. Brandon reached the steep, rocky slope that led to the second chamber. He scrambled up the loose stones on his hands and knees, tearing his fingernails against the rock, his headlamp swinging wildly. He looked over his shoulder for a fraction of a second. At the bottom of the slope, just 30 feet behind him, the blue-white light caught the towering gray silhouette. It was moving on all fours, its head hanging upside down from its elongated neck, its black eyes reflecting the light with a brilliant, predatory shine. The clicking sound from its throat was deafening now, vibrating through the solid stone walls of the cavern. Brandon screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated survival panic, and threw his body forward through a narrow archway leading to the final chamber. He knew the entrance fissure was just ahead, but he also knew the entry track required a slow, tight crawl on his stomach. If he tried to crawl, the creature would catch him before his torso even cleared the gap. He reached the base of the final limestone wall, where the horizontal fissure sat hidden behind the ferns. The cold outside air was blowing inward, smelling of fresh rain and forest earth. Brandon didn't slide into the crawlway. Instead, he grabbed his heavy digital camera, which was still securely strapped around his neck, and turned around to face the dark archway. The creature burst into the chamber, its long arms reaching out, its black claws outstretched. Brandon raised the camera, targeted the center of the dark room, and slammed his finger down on the shutter button. The high-powered external strobe flash exploded with a brilliant, blinding pop of white light, completely illuminating every single corner of the limestone cavern with the intensity of a lightning strike. The creature let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound like tearing sheet metal as the sudden, intense light hit its dilated black eyes. It recoiled violently, its long limbs buckling underneath its weight as it threw its torso backward into the shadows of the rocks to escape the glare. Brandon didn't wait for the flash to recharge. He dropped the camera, threw his body flat into the mud of the fissure, and clawed his way through the narrow opening with a frantic, desperate strength. The sharp limestone tore through his jacket and cut deep lines into his back, but he didn't stop until his head burst through the curtain of wild blackberry briars into the foggy afternoon air of the forest. He tumbled out onto the wet dirt of the ravine, scrambled to his feet, and ran blindly through the dense woods of the Daniel Boone National Forest, leaving his gear, his camera, and the cave behind him forever. 3 hours later, a search and rescue team found Brandon sitting on the shoulder of a remote logging road, covered in wet clay, his clothes torn to shreds, and his back bleeding from dozens of deep lacerations. He was shivering violently despite the mild spring air, staring blankly into the trees, completely unable to speak. The local ranger station, working alongside the Kentucky State Police, dispatched a team of 5 armed deputies to locate the coordinates of the undocumented cave the following morning. Because Brandon had left his GPS tracker inside his backpack at the terminal wall, the team was able to navigate straight to the hidden fissure in the ravine. When the deputies breached the narrow opening and moved through the subterranean chambers, they found the cave completely silent. The dry riverbed was empty, and Brandon's backpack was still sitting on the river pebbles at the very back of the gallery, untouched. But what the forensics team discovered when they retrieved Brandon's dropped digital camera near the entrance is what turned this case into a classified federal file. The camera's internal memory card was completely intact. When the technicians developed the final image, the one Brandon had taken right before escaping into the crawlway, the photograph showed the entire final chamber lit up by the strobe flash. The gray, emaciated creature was caught perfectly in the center of the frame, its torso twisting backward, its long fingers shielding its hairless skull from the light. But the photograph also revealed something the headlamp had completely missed. The creature hadn't emerged from the rock alone. In the brilliant white light of the flash, the walls of the final chamber were shown to be covered in dozens of small vertical fissures. And from inside every single one of those dark cracks, a pair of long, pale fingers was slowly reaching out into the room, meaning the mountain wasn't just holding one entity, the entire cave system was a living hive. The Daniel Boone National Forest authorities permanently sealed the entrance to the fissure 3 days later, pouring tons of solid industrial concrete into the ravine to block the gap completely. The cave was erased from all local conservation maps, and the file was handed over to a federal agency, remaining closed to the public to this day. Brandon Cole never returned to teaching biology, and he never entered the state of Kentucky again. He relocated to a high-rise apartment building in downtown Manhattan, choosing a space on the 40th floor where the ground is a distant memory and everything is constructed of steel, glass, and solid concrete. He managed to rebuild a quiet routine, but the psychological scars of that spring afternoon have never left him. He refuses to visit parks, he cannot sleep in a dark room, and he uses a high-powered flashlight for any nightly activity. Because according to Brandon, the true nightmare isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's shriek. The true nightmare lives in the knowledge of how close the dark truly is. Every time he walks past a brick wall or a cracked pavement, his eyes involuntarily lock onto the gaps. He realizes that you can be completely safe walking through a modern city with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just inside the solid structures of the world, something is sitting in the narrow spaces, chattering its teeth, and waiting for someone to find the crack in the stone.